Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our very first virtual therapy conference. If I can start by introducing myself, I'm Ruth Perry. I'm the Senior Policy Manager at Natspec, and I'm co-chairing today's conference with Kate Duggan. Morning, Kate.
Good morning, everybody.
Kate is Head of Clinical Services at Seashell Trust. We're co-chairing from opposite ends of the country. I'm down in London, Kate's up in the northwest, just outside Manchester. So I hope between us we will manage to coordinate ourselves. Just before we go any further, a little bit of webinar etiquette. I'm sure you're all getting used to this by now, but you'll notice you are all muted. There are just too many of you on to allow you all to be speaking at the same time. But please do use the questions pane. Not just for questions, but for comments throughout. I'll be keeping an eye on those and feeding questions back to the presenters and sharing your comments with everybody. Originally, as some of you will know, we had a therapy forum planned for early June, but obviously the coronavirus saw that one off. But we decided instead to put together a July conference in the form of a series of short webinars across a single day. Kate has very much put the agenda together, so if I could ask you now, Kate, to talk us through today's agenda and how you decided on these topics.
Yeah, sure. So certainly when we were expecting to have a physical therapy conference back in June, some of the key things that we really wanted to have opportunity to explore were around areas of our practice where we're looking to make changes, to use new types of interventions, and also areas that we're experiencing difficulties and challenges working in this specific context. So it seemed obvious we also had to incorporate, as we move to this more online model of a webinar, some of the ways that we've had to respond within the COVID-19 pandemic. And certainly later on this morning, we've got Rachel Johnson, who's our lead OT at the Seashell Trust, who's going to be talking to us about sensory processing assessments. And this is something she was going to explore in the original programme, but today she's also going to be taking that a bit further to explain how she's more recently been using telepractice to be able to continue to deliver the service remotely to young people and families who remain at home. I'm going to be in the next session sharing the findings from a research project that I completed a couple of years ago, and this is looking into what the barriers that we face as therapists working in ISCs in evidencing the impact of the support that we provide. And this really looks at, as we've moved towards a more embedded model of therapy delivery in specialist colleges, what the challenges are we faced in really being able to successfully achieve positive outcomes, but also capture those. And Caroline Gosling this afternoon is going to kind of continue with that theme. Caroline's our lead speech and language therapist at Seashell, and she's going to talk with you about a tool that she's developed and used to try and upskill teachers to successfully implement an inclusive communication environment within their classroom. So I'd really say that two key themes that we'll be running through today are around how we can successfully deliver an embedded model of therapy delivery in specialist colleges, but also the adaptations and changes we've had to make to our practice amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the final session, myself and Ruth are hoping to be able to spend some time getting a bit of feedback really from those of you who've used the guidance that's been shared on the Natspec website for therapists working during this time. And we're also really fortunate today to have Sally Edwards joining us, and Sally's going to be sharing the findings from an audit that she's completed across Natspec colleges. And Ruth, I don't know whether you could give us a bit more information about Sally's project?
Yes, we realised that we've gotten a huge amount of information about the education offer within our colleges, but much less about the therapies. So we commissioned Sally, who is a lead speech and language therapist at Landmarks and Portland colleges, to do a piece of work for us, really just investigating what therapies are being offered in our colleges, who is being employed on what types of contracts, what kind of activities they're involved in, just to get a better picture really of therapy provision across the Natspec membership. And we hope then we've got some kind of baseline so we can look at trends in the future. We can help individual colleges measure what they do against others, and really use it as a starting point to look at quality improvement of therapy provision across the colleges. So we're very much looking forward to hearing what Sally found, and thank you very much to all of you who participated in the survey that forms the basis of that work. So that's the agenda for today. You'll see it's a rich one, full of lots of different learning opportunities. We hope that you'll tune into as many of those sessions as you can, but obviously feel free to dip in and out according to your interests and your availability across the day. Kate mentioned there that we're going to finish the day by reflecting on how you've all managed during this pandemic to continue to deliver therapy to students even when they're at home. She mentioned our new Therapy at Home webpage. You can look at that at any point during the day. If you go to homelearning.natspec.org.uk, that's homelearning.natspec.org.uk, and click on the therapy tab, you'll see all the work that's been gathered there. Do email me during the day or pop things into the questions pane about that, because we would like to reflect a little bit with you at the end of the day on how you've used it, whether you think there's continuing relevance for it going forward, either in, of course, local lockdowns that may happen, but also more generally in your practice. So please do contact me during the day with those, and I will share some of that in our final session at the end of the day. Without further ado then, I'm going to hand over to Kate for her session on evidencing impact. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you, Ruth. And one final thing I'll just add before I get going with my session is, certainly since the COVID-19 pandemic, I found Twitter to be a really useful resource just for keeping up to date with changes to information and sharing ideas with other therapists. So I did wonder whether people might like to use a hashtag for the event today. Perhaps if we use hashtag Natspec Therapy. If people want to have any debates or discussions on Twitter, hashtag Natspec Therapy might be a good one for us to use. I'm now going to turn off my webcam while I deliver this session, just because in our trial runs there was sometimes quite a strong delay when lots of people were logged on. So I'm going to turn my webcam off. But I'm going to stay with you hopefully on the audio, and Ruth's going to let me know if there's any issues that come up with the audio or the visuals. Okay, so hopefully there you can see my first slide where I'm going to be talking about a research project which I completed a couple of years ago as part of my Masters in Professional Practice Development at Manchester Met University. And I was looking into the barriers faced by therapists working in independent specialist colleges in evidencing the impact of their support. And over the next half an hour, I'm going to talk about what the drivers were for the project, why it was that I selected this topic. I'm going to do a bit of a summary of the relevant evidence base in this area, which highlights the key pieces of research from a literature review that I carried out. I'm going to outline my methodology and what I actually did for the project. I'm going to talk you through my findings and describe the results of a thematic analysis that I carried out. And then finally, I'm hoping to sort of draw together some of the themes that came out of the project to really try and highlight some implications for practice, which may be of use as we continue to consider the best ways of working in specialist colleges. So hopefully you can see my slides moving, and we're now going to look at what the drivers were for this project. So I've worked in specialist colleges for quite a number of years, and when I started working in a specialist college environment, I'm a speech and language therapist, and the way that I tended to work was by delivering a programme of one-to-one speech therapy sessions for students on my caseload, along with some groups that I led around areas such as social skills or AAC. But in recent years, we've really seen quite a shift towards a more embedded model of therapy delivery in specialist colleges. Certainly, there continues to be a lot of value to those direct one-to-one sessions and groups, specifically in areas such as hydrotherapy, rebound or sensory integration sessions. But as a speech and language therapist and in some other areas of therapy, I have really seen this move towards a more embedded model where therapists are actually working within the classroom environment rather than withdrawing students for a therapy session. And I think, you know, I personally feel really passionately that therapists working in specialist colleges can have a really substantial positive benefit on the outcomes that our students experience. And certainly in the time I've spent working in specialist colleges as a speech and language therapist and as a manager, there's loads of anecdotal evidence of this real strong added value that a therapist can bring. However, I think sometimes as therapists we can struggle to really capture that impact successfully and report it in a way that's going to actually satisfy the local authority or CCG requirements for evidencing progress. Which, as we're aware, you know, our funding by the local authority or CCG is typically dependent on us being able to evidence that progress for the students. And I think the other thing that I've noted is that therapists spend large amounts of time writing up their clinical case notes, which is obviously a requirement of the HCPC and the relevant professional bodies, but also collating some very education-driven records. So having to collate targets, having to review these and liaise with the MDT on those targets, and also collate and submit progress reports. And I think it's just struck me that all of this is really time consuming and a huge amount of recording and data collection is taking place. But I think my sense was when I was completing this project that perhaps despite all of this recording, we were just missing some opportunities to really fully highlight this positive impact that therapists can bring within this setting. So when I decided that I was going to look into this topic of the barriers to successfully, truly evidencing the impact of therapy support in specialist colleges, I reviewed the evidence base. And it was several years ago now that I completed this project, but at the time there really wasn't any evidence in the literature that was specific to this particular setting, but I did feel that there was a large amount of relevance in the evidence base relating to therapists working with adults with learning disabilities and also therapists working within special school environments, because there was more of an evidence base in these areas. And what I did see was some very similar challenges to those that I was experiencing cited in the literature within these fields. And it seemed from the evidence that I reviewed, and just to say that I have got a full reference list that I'm more than happy to share with people sort of following the event if people would like to look up some of these pieces of work. But what I saw was that there was quite a focus on an indirect model of service delivery, certainly within adult learning disability settings, and that some of the similar challenges that we were facing in specialist colleges were being reported as this indirect model was being used. And something interesting that came through was that in multiple pieces of research, therapists were recognising that they were perhaps underestimating the amount of input that was required to be able to deliver this indirect model. So they weren't taking into account all the different types of activity required, because perhaps historically with a direct service delivery model, they were just considering how many minutes of direct therapy were being delivered a week. But within an indirect model, there was many different types of activity that they needed to consider to be able to secure sufficient funds and have the right amount of capacity to successfully be able to deliver this model. And the other interesting thing that came through in relation to the funding was a perceived or actual reduction in funding for individuals with intellectual disabilities as they got older. And I think for me this does really highlight the responsibility on us to get it right when we are delivering therapy support to students who are attending a specialist college, because perhaps these are their final years spent in education where they're going to be able to access this sort of level of comprehensive holistic therapy support. Other interesting areas which were highlighted through the literature review were that speech and language therapists, OTs and physios in the literature that I reviewed were acknowledging that they were really finding it difficult to identify the right tools to effectively capture outcomes as they worked with adults with learning disabilities or within special schools. And particularly in the adult learning disability literature, it is highlighted that more abstract concepts are particularly difficult to measure for therapists. So, for example, if they were trying to capture outcomes relating to quality of life, participation or engagement, they were really struggling to be able to find outcome measurement tools which were actually capturing changes in those areas. And as I reviewed the literature, I suppose I couldn't ignore it didn't just refer to the fact that it was challenging to capture outcomes, but sometimes it highlighted reasons why actually therapists were really struggling to achieve positive outcomes. And a lot of this related to the fact that the therapists were relying on carers or teaching assistants who perhaps had more limited skills and lots of pressures on their time and lots of competing priorities, which meant they weren't able to successfully implement the therapy strategies, which was having a negative effect on the successful achievement of outcomes for the clients that they were supporting. And also cited in the literature was a difficulty in understanding the therapist's role, and the fact that staff were not only finding it difficult to successfully implement therapy strategies and struggling to understand roles, but also there was a really high turnover in these staff teams. Which was a source of frustration and difficulty for the therapists within these studies, because they were having to do a lot more work to really try and upskill lots of different staff as they, in response to that turnover. So I think from this literature review, I was in some ways reassured that some of the challenges I felt we'd experienced in the specialist college environment were also shown in some other areas. And for me, it also really reiterated that this topic was a valid and useful one to explore within my research project. So I'm going to move on now to talking about what I actually did within the study. And I had 25 participants in the end from 7 independent specialist colleges who participated. And if anybody who's listening today did actually participate in the study, thank you so much, because I really, really appreciated the time people spent to be involved and the input that they provided. And I sent out emails to all therapists working within specialist colleges to recruit participants. And for me, recruiting participants via email and collecting the data via email was an efficient way to gather data from therapists working across lots of different colleges across the country. I am aware, though, that potentially this might have meant that I lost some depth of that data. But in terms of the time constraints that I was working within for the project, that did make it possible for me to be able to have participants from a broad range of colleges. And what I did once the participants had signed up and completed the consent forms was sent out 4 vignettes that described a typical student who may attend an independent specialist colleges. And I tried within those 4 vignettes to capture, a range of different types of profile of the sort of student that we may work with. And the reason why I did this was I was aiming to gather data relating to how an expert in their field might address a problem through observing how they tackle a task, rather than asking them to explain the difficulties that hypothetically they anticipate they might experience. And this was based on methodology devised by Erickson and Simon in the 1980s. And I felt that this would be a way of trying to get some really rich, meaningful data from my participants. And actually what I felt was that this was really successful, and the responses that were provided were really in depth and really gave me a good insight into how the specialists who participated might address their work with a student attending a specialist college. So the participants were required to select 2 of the 4 vignettes, and they had to respond to 6 questions, which essentially took them through, if you like, a sort of case study of how they might work with an individual from their specific discipline perspective. You will see when I move on to my results that there's names mentioned in the quotes. these are real names of students, but these are the names of the sort of hypothetical students within the vignettes that the participants commented on. And once I'd received from 25 participants these responses to the vignettes that they'd selected, I then used a framework analysis based on the work of Richie and Spencer to analyse that qualitative data. And I originally coded all of the raw data into basic themes, and then I grouped the basic themes into organising themes, and finally identified global themes. And this is in line with work that was done by Attride and Sterling. So this was the methodology that I used. And next of all, I'm going to talk about the findings. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through the 5 global themes that arose, and then I'm going to describe really some of the organising themes under each of these. And I've included lots of quotes on the slides. And this makes the slides quite busy, but I was really keen to just try and give you that flavour of the responses that were provided from the participants, and also just try and really bring to life the way that colleagues working in specialist colleges were really tackling some of these issues. So there's lots of information in the slides coming up, but these will be available after the conference, so feel free to have a good read through these afterwards. And I'm going to go through each one of these 5 global themes. So the first global theme that came through the data was that there was a real cohesion in the desired positive outcomes that therapists across the MDT were trying to achieve. The second global theme was that therapists showed a high level of creativity in adapting outcome measures, and also involving colleagues across the MDT within that outcome measurement. The third global theme related to limitations that therapists expressed that they felt were on them in terms of not being able to fully respond to need due to rigidity in the funding methodology. The fourth global theme came through really strongly, and it acknowledged how very complex the needs are of majority of the students that we're supporting, and that this could make it difficult to be able to capture progress. And the final global theme related to, due to this sort of more embedded model of working, inconsistency in the implementation of therapeutic strategies, which participants cited to be a limiting factor in being able to achieve positive outcomes. So, first of all, I'm going to unpick the first global theme, which was this cohesion in desired positive outcomes across the MDT. So not surprisingly, one of the positive outcomes that came through really strongly was that all the therapists who responded were aiming to promote skill development with the students they were working with. So this was development of communication skills, physical skills, independent skills. And I guess I felt this really matched the fact that we are based in an educational setting. So we are really contributing and trying to support that educational progress. So this seemed like a really positive and good cohesive outcome that came through from all participants, regardless of their discipline. The other area that came through was actually therapists trying to promote broader outcomes around students' health and emotional well-being, or around things like participation or quality of life. So they weren't only narrowly focused on skill development in their specific area relevant to their discipline, but they were viewing the student really holistically and trying to think about broader positive outcomes which would support students in various different contexts within their life. The second global theme was around the way that therapists talked about actually trying to overcome the challenges in capturing outcomes by using different measures and also collaborating with colleagues within education, and for those participants who worked at residential colleges, also with care colleagues. So there was a real focus on the use of targets. And a lot of people did talk about smart target setting as a way to really try and write targets that were very measurable. And people talked about not just doing this in isolation, but setting targets collaboratively, often with teaching colleagues, and talked about this as being a really successful way of capturing outcomes. The second sort of theme within this broader global theme that I pulled out was about the use of quantitative data. And, you know, I've got to say that lots of participants really focused on rich qualitative data, and there wasn't a lot of reference to quantitative data being used. But I did feel it was really important to include as an organising theme because it was very distinct and different from some of the other types of outcome measurement. So here's a quote with an example from an OT who was actually using time sampling to be able to monitor the frequency of self-injurious behaviour, and that they were focusing on using that and using that quantitative data analysis as an outcome measure. So that sort of stood out for me really, because there was only a couple of the participants who mentioned the use of this, and it felt of note really to include. The third organising theme in this area was around therapists talking about using developmental frameworks. So people described that they would compare a student's profile of skills against a developmental framework to really try and focus in on which areas they were going to target. And they talked about revisiting that developmental framework to consider whether progress had been made. And then the final area was that I thought it was really interesting that people talked not just about how they would measure outcomes for the student that they were working with, but also considered how they could actually capture the impact on the parent or carer skills. And given that you know, we have seen this move towards a more embedded model of working, and there's a lot of need for upskilling parents and carers, I thought that was really interesting that people were describing the ways that they would actually try and see whether the training and support they'd been provided had had the desired outcome on the parent or carer, to help them to evaluate whether or not that had been successful. So moving on to the third global theme, this looked at the therapists who participated feeling like there was real limitations on their ability to respond fully to the needs of their caseload due to rigidity and funding methodology. And therapists talked about the fact that they felt really strongly that they needed to be able to deliver therapy support, not just within the college setting in the classroom, but in other contexts within the student's life. But that they weren't able to do this because they were only funded to deliver support physically within the college environment. And leading on from this, they then talked about the fact that because of this support focus just in the college environment, that it could be really hard to generalise skills into other environments, such as somebody's home environment or into their workplace or other social contexts that they wanted to participate in and have better skills. And the other challenge that came through in relation to the funding was this idea that a student was only going to be funded at a college for either 1 year, 2 years, or maybe maximum of 3 years. And that it was therefore sometimes really hard for therapists to feel like they could successfully achieve these sometimes huge outcomes on an EHCP or outcomes that were being set at the start of a programme within that prescribed timescale. The fourth global theme related to the complex needs shown by the individuals that we are supporting. And therapists talked about the fact that for some of the students, they felt that it was really challenging to be able to evidence progress to the local authority who were commissioning the support, when, for example, some individuals had such complex physical presentations that actually a measure of success might be that a student has managed to maintain their physical skills, or that the therapist was perhaps able to evidence that there'd been slowed rate of deterioration against that individual's prognosis. So this was really cited as a challenge in being able to say what progress had been made in a certain area. Many of the participants, sort of regardless of their discipline, talked about the impact of a student's sensory processing needs. They described that it was sometimes hard for the student to engage in whatever therapeutic support they were trying to deliver because they weren't at a good sort of calm alert state for learning. So this presented a challenge in being able to successfully achieve the outcomes in their specific area if those sensory needs weren't met. An interesting theme which came through was that some of the therapists, as they sort of addressed these hypothetical cases, explained that they wondered whether physical access might actually be an issue in them successfully achieving outcomes. And this surprised me in some ways, because I guess I anticipated that in majority of specialist colleges, the setup would be such that physical access to the environments within that college wouldn't be a barrier. But this perhaps indicated that for some individuals, you know, they did anticipate that those physical access barriers could pose an issue in successfully achieving outcomes. The fourth area that came through in terms of this complexity of need was around students' communication impairments. So therapists talked about the fact that it was often really difficult to get feedback and truly, I guess, evidence that co-production and involve the student in their skill development due to their complex communication difficulties. And some people also talked about the fact that, for example, if they were trying to target physical skill development, it was again really hard to get the feedback from that student as to whether they were in discomfort or pain, or whether they were okay because of the lack of consistent communication signals that they were able to share. Capacity and consent came through as a challenge, and I think this really related to the fact that because all of the students we're supporting in specialist colleges are over 16, we've got to consider whether they have capacity to consent to treatment and therapeutic support. And if it's deemed that they lack capacity, we've got to take all actions that we can to try and involve them as much as possible within decision making. And I think some therapists acknowledge that at times, and this was particularly relevant in speech and language therapy, they were having to spend such huge amounts of time and investment in supporting the broader MDT around this area that was actually diluting and reducing the amount of capacity they had to really target the skill development. So it was quite multifaceted, really faceted, the challenge in that area, but yeah, it was one which came through. And finally, another challenge that came through was in relation to students not always being motivated to participate in the therapy sessions that participants felt they might deliver for these individuals. So this was really hard, because actually if the student wasn't engaged and motivated within the session, it could be really hard to get them to participate fully and again achieve those positive outcomes. So moving on to the fifth global theme, which was around this emphasis on the embedded model of delivery and the inconsistency in implementation of strategies. Participants felt that sometimes they were concerned that staff within the broader workforce, whether that was teaching assistants or care staff, didn't necessarily have the amount of knowledge needed and the skills to be able to effectively carry out their recommendations. And they also felt concerned that sometimes staff within the broader workforce didn't have the skills needed to be able to actually identify when some progress or change in somebody's presentation had been shown, so that they weren't confident that changes and development in skills of students was always going to be effectively and consistently recorded by the broader team. And probably not a surprise to a lot of you, but recruitment and retention of staff within the broader workforce also came up as something which impacted on successful delivery of programmes. And you could really hear in some of the responses given that therapy staff felt really frustrated, that sometimes they would feel like they were getting somewhere with successfully upskilling a staff member, but then they would leave and they'd be kind of back to square one and having to upskill a new member of staff to be able to deliver the therapy programme that they were recommending. And it also struck me that in the responses given, therapists were really having to take quite a role in leading staff teams through a sort of change process and having to do some of that change management. So they were having to really help broader staff teams to see the value of their therapy recommendations, to be able to persuade them that they should give priority and time to really using the strategies that the therapist was recommending. So hopefully I've given you a bit of a flavour there really of the responses given by the participants in the study, and I've talked through the challenges that were highlighted by the participants through these 5 global themes and the organising themes beneath these. Apologies, that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. This was a sort of really huge project, but hopefully I've given you a bit of a flavour of what the responses were. And I'm now going to move on to talk about what it feels like some of the implications for practice that have come through this are. So, firstly, I guess given what I explained in terms of one of my drivers for the project, I was quite surprised that there wasn't much discussion in the responses in relation to use of case notes. And because I'm aware that we all spend such a large amount of time having to log, our activity and our support of students in this setting through our case notes, I wonder whether we need to consider how we can utilise this data more to be able to highlight the impact of the support we're providing. And I'm really mindful that some of the content that we all record within our case notes isn't appropriate to share more broadly due to confidentiality and GDPR requirements. But I do wonder whether some of the really rich data that we're logging all the time, at Seashell Trust we use a SOAP note format. So in every case note entry we are having to analyse what the student's response has been or what the parent or carer's response has been to training. And I do just wonder whether some of that could be used to really help to sort of tell a story and take the relevant stakeholder, whether it's the teacher, whether it's the local authority commissioner, through that journey of the distance travelled since the student has been attending the specialist college in terms of the impact that the specialist therapy support has had. I also feel that perhaps contained within those case notes or on other recording systems, whether there maybe is a bit more quantitative data that we could be drawing on, such as that example given in the quote around the time sampling, whereby maybe therapists are contributing quite a lot to behaviour incident reporting systems. And I just feel that actually that could offer some really robust data to be able to evidence that due to therapy support within a sort of positive behaviour support model, therapists have been able to promote skill building, which has led to a reduction in or contributed to a reduction in behaviours of concern, which has had a hugely positive effect on a student's quality of life. So yeah, just a thought as to whether there is other types of maybe quantitative data that we're also logging that we need to draw on more to be able to really highlight the impact of our work. I also think another area we need to consider is the language we use to communicate our outcomes with commissioners. I think, we've all got a lot of expert knowledge in our relevant area, and I think sometimes we can be guilty of using really complex terminology, but we need to really think about how can we use terminology and language that a range of stakeholders are going to understand to really bring to life those broader benefits of our work around someone's quality of life, around their ability to participate in different environments in their life. And I think the knock-on effect on their self-esteem and confidence. These are all things which I think as therapists we can really promote, but we need to find tools which are going to capture gains in these areas. And some of the literature that I've sort of reviewed since I did this study have highlighted that in some areas therapists can sometimes select outcome measurement tools or assessment tools which are really impairment based and that don't necessarily allow us to capture these broader outcomes from a more social perspective. And I'm aware that there are tools out there such as things like the ICF, which we could maybe draw on more to capture broader gains around participation and well-being and quality of life. So I think, therapists working within this sector, I think we need to work together to find tools that are going to capture those broader outcomes and try and really develop more standardised outcome measures so we can promote that benchmarking. This is going to help us to evaluate whether it's not just that we're seeing positive outcomes within our organisation, but also compare what are the levels of outcome, achievement we're seeing in our organisation against other similar services. And, you know, I think it's really important that we continue to really collaborate with our colleagues in education and care across the multidisciplinary team in measuring outcomes to make sure we've got that really holistic perspective of the students that we're supporting. And I think the literature from adult learning disability services and also special schools can be really used to inform our models of service delivery in relation to training and staff support. And there's a lot of interesting literature out there which suggests that so often we will try and deliver, or certainly in my experience in the organisations I've worked in, we've spent a lot of time planning and delivering quite formal training to staff teams in a classroom type environment on specific therapy approaches. But some of the evidence is increasingly suggesting that this might lead to increased knowledge for the staff team. And I think in my experience, staff often do feel afterwards that they're more confident, and on self-report measures, staff demonstrate more confidence in using therapy strategies. But the risk is that it doesn't lead to that change in behaviour that we need to see, whereby staff are actually using the strategies in their practice for the benefit of their students. So I think more and more we've got to find ways of using techniques such as coaching and modelling, where we're actually getting alongside staff teams and showing them how to use the strategies in the context they're working within. Because I think sometimes, and certainly this has been my experience, that I've come up with something that in theory is going to be a really worthwhile and effective strategy for a student, but then when I've gone and tried it in the context, it hasn't quite worked and I've had to make changes to it. So I think we need to be really careful that we're following up after we've done some you know, baseline training to make sure staff have got those fundamental skills and that basic knowledge. I think after that we need to build on that skill development for the staff members using coaching and modelling. I also think this gives us more credibility. I think if we're actually showing that we are willing to get alongside our staff teams and work with some of the most complex students that we're supporting, that's going to help to build those relationships and rapport that means that staff are going to see us as credible and that they're going to trust that we're going to be able to support them with strategies that are going to not just promote better outcomes for their students, who they probably feel really passionate about, but that it might actually make their life easier. It might make their role more enjoyable and more satisfying. And I think we need to really help broader staff teams to understand our role as therapists better. I think in some disciplines there's still really an underdeveloped understanding across the broader workforce in a specialist college around what therapists can bring and what value we can add. Certainly in recent years, I've focused a lot on how we can really try to use robust funding methodology to make sure we're allocating enough time for all these different types of activity. So not just when we do that initial assessment of a new student, not just thinking about how many minutes we might need to physically spend with them, but also ensuring that we're considering how long it's going to take us to plan and deliver training, to offer that coaching and modelling, to write really high quality written guidance that's going to support the broader team to be able to successfully implement our strategies. And if we can do this and provide a really robust argument to the local authority of why we need that amount of funding, hopefully we're going to have enough capacity within our therapy teams to be able to support these positive outcomes. And I think as well, we also need to think about how can we evaluate whether we are successfully supporting parents, carers, teachers, teaching assistants to be able to increase their knowledge and build their skills. Because if we're able to evaluate whether that's working, then that's going to really help us to unpick if somebody isn't using a therapy strategy successfully, it's going to really help us to unpick why is it that they're not using it, and then hopefully really target the support we're providing better. And I think if we can support a really good quality CPD programme for the broader workforce, we can perhaps actually help to combat the issue around recruitment and retention that we do see within our sector. If we can help staff to feel like they're gaining skills and that they're able to more effectively support their students' needs, hopefully that's going to make the workforce more motivated. It's going to make them want to stay working within this environment. And I also think, you know, ultimately that's going to have better outcomes for the students if they've got a more consistent, skilled workforce supporting them. And I'd like to think it's going to make our jobs as therapists more satisfying, and it's going to make us feel more motivated. So hopefully there's also more job satisfaction for therapists as well. So I'll sort of finish really by saying I certainly don't feel I've got all the answers of how to combat the barriers that have been identified through this piece of work. But I do think that these areas that I've discussed in the implications for practice are areas that we do need to consider to continue to try and improve the service that we provide for the students we're working with, and also to promote retention of the really valued therapists that work in independent specialist colleges by recognising the really positive impact that therapists can offer in this setting. So thank you so much for listening to this session. I'm really happy to take any questions which have come through on the chat. And also, if you'd like a full reference list, or I do also have a list of the actual outcome measurement tools that the participants cited that they use. So I'm really happy to share that as well if anybody wants to email me. And I think as well, I'd just say, I really feel like I've just started to dig into this topic by considering what barriers we face. And please get in contact if you feel like you'd like to almost pick up this piece of research where I've left off in terms of pulling together more of those solutions around how therapists are able to successfully capture outcomes. So if I hand over back to you, Ruth, and you can just let me know if there are any questions that have come through while I've been talking.
Thanks very much, Kate. Thank you for a really excellent input there as well. It's fascinating to listen to your research, but also then to think about what do we do with those findings? How do we use what you've discovered as part of that? And hopefully somebody will want to pick up that baton and take it further. I hope people will want to do that informally in any case, but if anybody wants to do that in a more formal way, then do get in touch with Kate. We haven't had any direct questions come through during your session. I would reassure people that we will get out everything that you've promised there in terms of your reference list, also the slides. The webinar is also being recorded, so we'll send a link round to that as well afterwards if you wanted to watch it again or to share it with other colleagues. But thanks very much for that, Kate. There's a little action going on Twitter as well using the hashtag Natspec Therapy, so please do get involved with that. We're going to take a very short break now so that we can get Sally set up ready for her session at 11 o'clock. So I'm going to close down the webinar briefly while we sort that out. We'll start again at 11. When we get to 11, we're going to flow from Sally's straight through to Rachel Johnson's input on using telepractice. So you'll just have to re-log in once during the morning. We'll close it down again over lunchtime and you'll need to log back in then. But thank you very much for now. Thanks, Kate, and we will regroup at 11 o'clock. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the second session of our Natspec Therapy Conference this morning. For those of you just joining us, welcome. We've already had a very lively, interesting session from Kate Duggan, but we're now moving on to welcome Sally Edwards, who is a speech and language therapist, lead therapist at Portland and Landmarks College, and she undertook a piece of work for us as an associate for Natspec, looking at the state of therapy across the Natspec membership. Just a very quick bit of webinar etiquette. If you're just joining us, you'll notice that you are all muted. That's because there are so many of you on the line. But please do use the questions pane to ask Sally any questions, or also to make comments as you're listening, either questions to Sally or more generally to Natspec, or for me to ask of the wider audience as well. Okay, just also to remind you that the session's being recorded and copy of the slides and the recording will be available afterwards. So without further ado, welcome Sally. We look forward to hearing what you found for your audit.
Okay, thank you, Ruth, and hello to everybody that's listening. It's very interesting to try and present anything this way, as I'm sure people that have done this realise, because you have no feedback and no visuals, and as a speech and language therapist, we're always looking at people's facial expressions and their feedback in terms of responding to what we're saying. So I will do my best to make the slides accurate and come to life for you. I can't say hi on a webcam, I'm sorry, I can't get that working, but never mind. So the background to this is, as Ruth said, I am a lead speech and language therapist, and I'm actually an NHS therapist that's contracted into 2 different colleges, and I've had around 12 years experience in specialist colleges. And the background to this audit coming about is having a conversation with Natspec initially about representation of therapists on their board. And from that, there was a much more detailed conversation, and I was asking questions such as, well, do we know, are we sure how many of the Natspec colleges have therapy provision, and if they do we know what it is? Do we know what whole-time equivalents there are, which therapies are represented? And the answers to a lot of those questions were we didn't really know, and to Natspec's credit, they said, well, let's try and find out. And that's how this audit was sort of commissioned, which I've done as an independent therapist, and as Ruth said, as an associate, so it's not related to either of the colleges that I work at. So thanks to Natspec for commissioning it in the first place. It was quite a big ask to come up with some of the information that we try to, and as with many of these things, when you do this, you realise that you have probably generated more questions than answers in the end. But it was interesting, and I'm going to just share the key results with you, because I have drafted a sort of 16-page report, and I have about 50 pages of data from the survey, and it's really quite difficult to have summarised it into these slides, but I'll do my best, and I hope it makes sense. So when we sat down and thought about what we were trying to do if we did this audit, these were the key things that we were trying to look at. I'm not sure, in fairness, that we achieved all those aims, because as I say, it's very much a learning process, and you look back and think, I could have done that differently, or I should have asked that differently. But we were looking at, and this links, I was listening to Kate's presentation, and it links, I think, a lot of the information that's come out from this audit links a lot to what Kate has said about all kinds of things around impact and how we work in embedding therapists, but we'll get to that towards the end of the presentation. So these were our aims. I'm not going to read off slides because you can all read, but it was around value and role of therapy. It was about assessing that impact, which again is so important and comes up time and time again. It was, Natspec really wanted to know about what kind of support they could offer us in terms of the therapies. And then obviously for any sort of thing you want to, anything like this, like an audit, you want to have the so what identified at the end. So, you know, we have the information, what are we going to do with it? What does that mean? Where are we going to go from here? So this is what happened in terms of the process. So I did an audit of the information on the Natspec website, which at the time that I did this, there were 88 colleges registered with Natspec, independent specialist colleges. There was a survey sent out to all the specialist colleges. Those results were analysed, and there was both quantitative and qualitative data in there. I have the draft report is written, and I did get to share the results, or a slightly longer presentation than this, at the Natspec board at the beginning of March, just before all the lockdown happened. And obviously I was due to present live at the therapy conference, and this is the stand-in presentation for that. And then obviously we needed to look at what actions and recommendations would come out of the report. I'm aware that I know a lot of things that sit behind these slides, so I'm going to try and give you some of that information. So in terms of the report as well, in terms of the response, first of all, therapists are great at responding to surveys. I know that the average percentage response to surveys when they go out is scarily low normally, but actually the response rate, we had 54 out of 88 colleges actively respond, which was a 61.5% response rate, which was brilliant. Also, from doing the cross-reference with the information on the Natspec website in terms of what colleges said about their therapy provision, I identified, and that is assuming that that information is correct, it has to be said, but I identified at least 9% of colleges that said they had no therapy input at all. So that would mean that they couldn't have responded to any of the questions. So if you add those things together, we were looking at maybe a 70% response in terms of what we knew about therapies at the colleges that had responded, and the ones that could respond and the ones that wouldn't have been able to respond totaled about 70%. As I said, I cross-referenced some of the therapy information we had with the information on the Natspec website and what they said about their specialist therapy provision. And the other thing that I did was I did get a literature search done using a library facility, and needless to say that I don't think anybody's going to be surprised by this, but when you put in intellectual disabilities therapies and specialist colleges into the literature search, the result is 0 in terms of anything that hits those 3 criteria. I have made reference to some research in the draft report because we expanded that search to include all colleges and all specialist education and all institutions and all residential type establishments, and therefore that there were only 4 studies that I could actually reference in terms of them being relevant to what we were looking at, but those 4 all showed a sort of positive response to therapy input. Okay, so the first question we asked was what is the actual therapy representation in-house? And I'm going to keep saying to the colleges, in the colleges, but you must obviously you understand that that is just the respondents to the survey. For the other 30%, I don't know what's happening. So I'm not just going to keep going respondents because that's very dull to listen to. So of the colleges, this was the therapy representation. So SLT at the highest, you can all read figures. These were the allied health professional therapies that we identified in the audit. I know that there are some others and they are picked up in the data, but they were very minimal in terms of their representation, like psychology and well-being type roles. They will be referenced in the report. So after we asked the question about what therapies have you got, and how many colleges have speech and language therapy, for example, or how many colleges have occupational therapy, the next question was how do you have those people? How do you have those therapists at your college? And so this is representative of all the therapies, as you can see. It's difficult to crunch numbers when you've got lots of data. You can do it by therapists, you can do it all sorts of different ways, but this is a real summary of the information that I got from doing the audit. So this is representative of all the therapies. If you took all the therapies and you divided by the 6 therapies, the percentages, this is what we got. So we got that 45%, nearly half of the therapists in the sector that we knew about are directly employed by colleges. 11% contracted in, 13% independent who have a regular session, 8% of independents who were employed on a needed basis when needed, and 90% said they had no therapy provision at college, some of them, but they accessed community services. So they did have therapy provision, but not via people that they employed themselves. Another thing that we wanted to find out, because this is so important in terms of relating to funding, whether commissioners are interested in providing funds for therapies. Certainly at the colleges I work at, it's a question that's asked about whether therapy provision is mentioned on their education, health and care plans, the learners. So these are, you can see the graph. I've put the graph in because I want you to realise I'm not making up the figures, but in terms of summarising them. So over half, this is a really difficult slide to understand because it's in 2 percentages. I've got no idea why the survey gave it me that way, but it did, and it's given me a nightmare. But these are the two sort of key. You can look at the bars there, but these are the key pullouts that over half of the colleges that responded say 70% or more of their learners have got some kind of therapy recommendation on their EHC plans. Now, we didn't dig into the detail. I don't know whether that's regular. I don't know which therapist that is. I don't know whether they'll be overseen or have monitoring once a term. So there is a whole raft of other information embedded in there that I accept we simply don't know about. But as somebody that manages 2 teams into colleges, it's something that we have to be aware of, certainly in terms of allocating our time and prioritising our input. That is around which learners have specified, in my case, speech and language therapy on their EHC plans. So I thought it was an important question to ask because I had no idea what the answer would be when we asked it. And there are the answers. So it's variable, but it's surprising to see that I think over half have got 70% plus. I was surprised that it was that many given some of the battles that I have sometimes in my role. So the next question we asked was, what work does your therapy teams cover? Do your therapy teams cover? So I ordered this from the results into highest to lowest percentages. So that's the list in order that you see there. And I calculated the total percentages for each activity. The activities were given. So these are the ones that were identified in the audit that people responded against, and it was a yes or no. So the top one, there we go, relating to the last slide, providing hours and time listed against the support listed in the EHC plans. Staff training, obviously that's really high up there. Other, which we'll come to in a minute. So there was a category for people to specify other on top of these identified categories. Assessing new learners, providing therapy support to learners who don't have it in their EHC plans, and then support with environmental resources and adjustments within college that help, in my view, support the college to be a specialist environment. We didn't want to miss capturing the information in the other category because this could take a lot of time. Well, you can see going back, you can see it came third on the list. So it does take a lot of time in terms of what therapists do. And these were the activities that people identified in the other category, but was taking quite a lot of their time. And interestingly, you know, Kate was talking about how much indirect work we do. And I think a lot of this is indirect, not all of it, but a lot of it is indirect support. And again, we've got to think about how we capture that. And also, I think it shows what a large range of work the therapy teams cover when they are supporting learners. Okay, so the big question about demonstrating impact. So in terms of how this question was asked, so that you understand it, the best you can the slide. These were, again, identified categories. So reporting against EHCP outcomes was an option. But people, as you can see from the bar, had the option to rate this from we always use this, we frequently use this, occasionally or not at all. So when I took the results of the methods that people said we always use this or we frequently use this, so the methods that are used the most in most of the colleges, this is the order in which it came out. So again, EHCP outcomes are important, and reporting against those was top of the list. Using reports to show progress and to presumably report against targets and work done in therapy sessions or therapy input. Use of specific therapy targets, involvement in target setting and achievement, and inclusion in education goals, feedback from staff, learners and families. And actually at the bottom of the list, which again, Kate has mentioned, and it is something that has been discussed a lot about, how do we identify a good outcome measure for us to be measuring the impact and demonstrating the impact of what we do as therapists? Because I feel that what came out, I'm probably saying something ahead of what I've written on my notes now, but what came out was, and again, Kate referred to this in her presentation, there is a lot of anecdotal evidence and a very strong feeling that therapists add a lot to the specialist education offer, but there has to be a way that somehow we demonstrate that impact, because that's what we're constantly being asked to do, is to how do we demonstrate the impact. It's interesting that an outcome measure is last on the list on this occasion in this audit. So this is a tricky slide. I apologise for it. It's trying to summarise a lot of information in one slide. But this question, as you can see, was about how well significant stakeholders understand the role and the contribution of therapies. So the options in terms of the survey, so again, that you understand where that information has come from. The options were, you could select fully understand, reasonably understand, partially understand, or don't really understand at all. The organisations or the groups of people that were rated in that way were the board, the senior management, direct line managers, tutors, LSAs, or whatever you call your support staff in your college, parents and carers, learners, AHP, allied health professional colleagues, and commissioners. So those were the groups of people, and then in the audit, people reported whether they felt that those groups of people fully, reasonably, partially, or didn't understand the role of therapists. So this is the slide that tries to pull all that together. So senior managers and direct line managers were most likely to fully understand our role, which is not really surprising because we work with those people and we report to them. Commissioners and learners, again, learners isn't surprising, but I wanted to put them in there, I didn't want to leave them out. But commissioners were the least likely to, and that raises a whole range of questions for us. The board in different colleges was actually fairly evenly split. So there was a fairly even split between some completely or reasonably or partially. So that was a very varied picture. College staff such as tutors and LSAs, alongside parents and learners, were the ones most identified as reasonably understanding our role. And over 50% of the respondents said commissioners only partially understood or did not understand at all the role and the contributions of the therapists. And as I've said there, that has significant implications for us because they are commissioning services and they have a major impact on our funding and learner placements and provision, and whether they will support therapeutic input. So this was a big question that Natspec wanted to ask, to their credit. They wanted to know at the end of this information gathering, and it was information gathering, as well as trying to look ahead and get some recommendations. I think the thing that I said when I was having my discussions with Natspec, I as I say, I've been in specialist colleges for 12 years, and in that time, there has been a really significant shift in so many things, but particularly the pressure on funding, the pressure on commissioning, the difference between whether something is education funding or should be health funding, the CCG's understanding of situations and commissioning and how that works in general. And there has been a real shift and a real change. And I said to Natspec, how do we know? Do we know whether there are therapies in all of your colleges? What percentage of your colleges have therapies? And have those numbers gone up or have they gone down? And the point is we don't know, because we've never had that snapshot in time. And if this audit serves as nothing else, it serves as a snapshot in time, so that if at some point in the future we want to look at how therapy provision is changing potentially in the specialist colleges sector, we do have that snapshot in time now of audit information. And if we ask the same information again, we will be able to look at changes, which is something I don't think we've been able to do before, because I just don't think we've had that information. So following on from the snapshot in time in terms of the data of the slides, I have really just absolutely whistled through, and I apologise for that. But the end result is, what do we do with that information? And that's a really big question and really quite hard to pull together, but this is my attempt at some of it. So the answer to the question in the survey, what can Natspec do to support, was not a selective quantitative question. It was a qualitative question. So I allowed people to type what they wanted and say what they wanted from Natspec, which was a lot of data to look at. And to be fair, even though the draft report is written, I'm quite sure I'll be going back to that and looking at it again. But one of the things that I did do in terms of trying to pull out themes is I did that in a number of different ways. But one of the ways was I did a word cloud, just because they're immense fun to do. And actually, they also provide you with some good information. So for those of you who don't know what that is, you really highlight the main areas of the text, keywords, not your normal, the normal sort of high frequency words are disregarded. And you put it into a word cloud and you ask it. In this case, the one that you're looking at right now is a word cloud where I said, give me the word cloud that's produced when something is mentioned at least 3 times or more. So these are the keywords that came out from the qualitative data. And you can see that obviously therapy and therapies is in there, but opportunities are in there, education, understanding. And I think that is different. I think that's education of the people that need to understand what our role is, and us working with education. There was a lot of stuff about best practice and sharing that, about providing guidance, about supporting the therapies, about looking at how we demonstrate impact. Impact is there. The size of the word also reflects how many times it was mentioned. So obviously we're going to get therapy in there a lot, but demonstrate is in there, impact is in there in quite big font. How do we provide our services? What's our provision look like? And those were the keywords, and it was just an interesting exercise to do, I think. I just wanted to share, I think partly so you know that I'm not making it up, that some of the quotes from the qualitative data. So I will let you read them, but these are some, just a very few from a lot of data. Some of the quotes that came back from that qualitative question, you know, what do we need support with? So I used another method, which I won't go into, of trying to pull out the themes from the qualitative data in response to that question, which will be the focus for future work in terms of how can Natspec support us? What do we do with the information we've gathered? What is it telling us about the state of therapies in independent specialist colleges? What do we do with that? So these are the themes that came out. Sharing best practice. These are in no particular order. These are just the themes that came out. Promoting the role of therapies with key stakeholders such as commissioners, local authorities and boards. Looking at impact, outcomes and quality. So I think, you know, how do we develop that work to again, links to what Kate has said this morning, how do we show impact, how do we record against outcomes, how do we deliver quality services and show that? What training and network opportunities were something that people really wanted and were positive about. And again, how therapies are embedded in the college. How do we work within the colleges? Again, that's a theme of today, I think. So we're now trying to do something a bit exciting, aren't we, Ruth? Which I have to say I have no control over whatsoever, which is to go to a poll. So the idea is that I have said to you now, these are the themes that seem to come out. And the question to you, if we can make this work, is what, if you could select one of those as your focus for going forward for Natspec to ask them for support and help in future work, which one would it be? Ruth, do you want to say anything?
You should have on your screen now all the 5 options there that Sally's just run through. And if you can just start voting, you need to pick a top one. You probably think they all matter, but we're looking for priorities here. So what should we focus on? I'll keep that open a little bit longer. People are busy voting, Sally. Unfortunately, Sally as the presenter can't see this, but there's lots of voting going on. I will close the poll when I see that everybody's had a chance to vote. Panelists, I'm really sorry, you don't get a chance to do this. You'll just have to observe what happens in a moment.
So I don't get a chance to vote on my own work or see the results. Great.
No, you have to rely on me, I'm afraid, Sally, to share it with you. We're nearly up to 100% voting. If you plan to vote,
just like it's life on the edge.
If you plan to vote, do it now. And I'm going to close the poll in a second. And there we have the results on the screen. So the most popular pick there, top priorities, with 48% of respondents, is developing how to demonstrate impact, outcomes and quality, followed with 25% by promoting the role of therapies with key stakeholders, such as those commissioners that Sally was just talking about, and then quite a significant drop down to training and networking opportunities at 13%. And I'm going to guess they're possibly because we've got some of those in place already, so they're welcome but not a priority to add more. 10% collating guidance on how therapies are embedded in colleges, and 4% sharing best practice.
Okay. How interesting. That was great to be able to do that and get input from people around the themes that have come out, and because obviously the people here are the ones working in colleges, it's really important to have your view. I'm so glad we could do it as a poll. So really we're looking at just under 75%, which is a massively significant number, looking at those 2 key features. How do we develop the work around impact, outcomes, quality, which is something I'm sure that we are all being asked about and trying to work on all the time. Relates back to Kate's presentation this morning, first thing. Certainly impacts all the time on what I do in my role in 2 different colleges. And yes, and that significant, important factor that is around how do people understand what we bring, and those 2 are related, aren't they? If we can demonstrate our impact and our outcomes and our quality better, then we can use that information to promote our role with the key stakeholders. So I think those two are really well linked together. I think I'm not surprised that those are the two that have come out, although yeah, nearly 50% for the one is significant. So the other thing that we wanted to take the opportunity to do is, I'm aware that I'm just over time, but this is the
You're
last
okay.
thing. So
you're okay, Sally.
So I've tried really hard to stick to time. So the other thing is that was great to be able to do the poll, and I will reflect some of that in the draft report about what people voted for in this forum. But if people have ideas, really practical ideas, because that's the next stage, isn't it? Let's identify what we want to work on, but then how are we going to do that practically? How are we going to do that? And I know that not any of us are going to come up with a marvelously well-formed idea right now on the spur of the moment. But if you have any practical ideas or any suggestions that you'd like us to take forward from this presentation, then please just type them into the chat as we're coming to the end of this presentation, because Ruth can collate those, and we can certainly look at using those in terms of going forwards from this audit, in terms of how we use the information and what we do with it. So thank you for listening. I hope it was interesting. It's a bit difficult for me to present it because I've been embedded in 50 pages of data, and I'm not sure that I summarised it well. I hope I did. I hope I summarised it in a way that you could understand it, and that it was interesting for you as therapists working in colleges, and that for the first time we have this snapshot. And I will happily try and answer any questions, but I absolutely, as it says on the slide, don't guarantee I can answer them all.
Thank you very much, Sally. That was really interesting. As you say, we've come from a sort of ground zero of very little information at all, and it feels like we have got you know, a good basic picture now of where we are and what the issues are. And as you say, now's the time to think about how we move forward with that. A comment from Kate, who's listening in the background in our panelist zone, unable to put questions to you, but she's noted that she says, I'm not surprised that commissioners didn't have a good understanding of therapists' roles. I'd be really interested to hear from anyone who has found ways of successfully working with commissioners to promote the role of therapies. So if that's you, if you've got a good working relationship with your commissioner who really understands the role of therapies within a learner's programme, then do put a note into the questions pane and we'll follow up with you.
Absolutely. Any of those things on the final 5 themes that came out, any sharing of good practice and good experiences would also be great.
We've had a question from Catherine Slaughter asking us if the report will be circulated to therapists once finalised. I can't see any reason at all why we wouldn't publish it, and when we do, we will alert everybody who's part of the therapy forum. So absolutely. Some comments, Sally saying thank you very much, really interesting and informative. And then a very specific question from Daniela, who asks, can you tell me how the word cloud diagram is colour coordinated? Is it categorised by themes?
No, they just give you a colour palette and I went with it. It's really not that technical. I'd love to say that it was, but it isn't. Oh, I don't think it is.
I think you're right.
If it was.
It's just a way of making it easy on the eye to see those different words, popping out. But they're great fun to do, as Sally said.
Shall I go back to it?
They can give you quite a surprising visual take on what people have dwelt on the most.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? It would be really interesting to know from you whether there was anything surprising in Sally's findings. If there's anything that you seem to be doing significantly differently from the sort of practice that Sally uncovered there. Use the questions pane to make a note of anything that occurred to you as she was going through. And as Sally said, if you have got ideas, so practically how we take forward those two priorities, seems to be a real theme emerging from the first two sessions around demonstrating impact. If you're working on that, perhaps you've not got that far, but it's something that you are experimenting with in college, again, let us know. Perhaps we can pull people together who are focused on that, and get you to sort of share notes, put your heads together. So we've got a comment from Catherine Maunder, who notes that it really helps when case holders from the local authorities come to annual review meetings and the therapist who attend can outline exactly how they're involved face to face. I don't know whether any of you have taken part in virtual reviews in the last few weeks, last month or months. But we've had some very positive feedback from colleges and students who've said that they felt sort of more involved, but also that more people have attended. So you've got a wider range of professionals in attendance, and therefore more opportunity for people to get to understand each other's roles. So we've got a comment from Gail Strawson, a period of consultation when new students are being considered by the college, so we get to feed back the amount of SLT a student may need and maybe go back to the local authority to renegotiate. We have talked this year, we've been in conversation with the Local Government Association and the Directors of Children's Services, suggesting that colleges, particularly where they've had to do virtual assessments or feel that assessments are incomplete of new starters, that they will need to be there will need to be some revisiting of those assessments and perhaps some renegotiating of funding around that.
I think some of the issues or the things that we just need to consider as well is that when you know, as with the audit, you start and you collect information or you get an answer on something or you make a suggestion about something, and then it's a little bit like a domino effect. You know, there are other things that then you suddenly have to start to consider. So one thing is, in terms of the last comment, absolutely about assessments, but I would imagine that a lot of colleges have very potentially different ways of how they assess their potential new learners. So that will go into the mix in terms of how we address that question of trying to get our presence and our value noted at the beginning of somebody's educational placement. And I'm trying to think what the other comment was. Oh yeah, the other comment was about our attendance in reviews or person-centered reviews, or whatever your college again calls them. And again, that is a great point, and I totally understand that and take it on board. But then we've got to start thinking about, out of that comment is, well, what's the capacity of the team within college to attend all the reviews on their caseload, and how do we prioritise that work, and is it possible to get to everybody's? And we can only make that case in a review if the local authority representatives attend, which certainly in the colleges I work at is not always the case. So it's that it's great that we're getting lots of suggestions. That's really good, but it does start off that sort of domino thing of we need to consider. It starts making you have to consider other things about how people are set up, size of your teams, capacity, all kinds of things.
I had a comment. We're going to have to wrap up now because we're moving towards the next session, but we've had a comment about how it would be useful to understand funding models for other ISCs to be able to compare notes, really, and that the person putting this one forward said that they have a blanket approach, just under 1 hour a week per student, regardless of needs in EHCPs. Now, I know that's very different in other settings, but it would be interesting to compare notes. And Kate is busy commenting in the chat pane, thinking about really how we take some of this work forward. she's interested to know if there's an appetite amongst people to participate in a virtual task and finish group around outcome measures. If you think you'd like to be involved in that, then drop us a note. You can use the question pane to record your interest here and now, but do follow up as well. That sounds like a great idea, Kate, to do that. And Rachel, who we'll be hearing from in a moment, she's suggested possibly Natspec could run an event about how to write up single case studies, as they can be powerful but possibly easier for individual therapists to achieve than larger scale studies. And for your non-specialist stakeholders, they can be very powerful. Sorry, over to you, Sally.
Sorry, I was just going to say I've referenced single case studies in the draft report and a document from RCSLT that looks at outcomes and how you can demonstrate different outcomes, and single case studies is certainly mentioned in there as quite a powerful method.
So thank you very much for all those suggestions and questions. That's really helpful. We're going to stay live, so bear with us while we do a little bit of jiggery-pokery, moving over to Rachel, who's going to be talking to us about using telepractice. But thank you very much to Sally. Really interesting piece of work, and I think it's probably, it's going to be the start of some much more focused work and support from Natspec on therapies. So thank you very much for that.
You're welcome. Thank you for listening.
So I'm going to hand over now to Rachel Johnson, who's the lead occupational therapist at Seashell Trust and also an advanced practitioner in air sensory integration. So welcome, Rachel. We look forward to hearing your session today.
Hi. I felt like Kate and Sally, I would turn my webcam on to say hello, but then I think I will turn the webcam off as it does seem to make the signal better. So I'll do that now. Oops. Sorry, that's as I've turned it off, I seem to have whizzed on through the presentation. I'll try again. So I'm going to talk to you today about using telepractice to assess sensory processing difficulties in people with complex learning disabilities and behaviours of concern. As Kate said, when we originally put together this programme, I was going to talk about assessing people with sensory processing difficulties that couldn't follow standardised assessments, and due to the lockdown, I've added in the telepractice bit to accommodate the situation. Oh. Sorry, I'm having some trouble with my mouse. There we go. So I thought I'd start with a bit of an introduction to me and the team that I work in. So I work at Seashell Trust. This is a picture of our occupational therapy team. I am very fortunate at Seashell Trust that we do have quite a big multidisciplinary team. We've got occupational therapists, speech and language therapists, physio and audiology all on site, and we do have a very multidisciplinary team approach. So the aim of occupational therapy on site is to facilitate our students' participation in educational and functional activities of daily living. So we're working as all occupational therapists about increasing independence, but because of the unique needs of our children and young people, we're focusing a lot on their ability to maintain a just right level of alertness, because that helps them to maximise their function. So I'll start by telling you what a typical assessment looks like for us at Seashell. We start with a prospective student assessment, which until lockdown was always on site. We would get maybe half an hour to assess the young person in that time and magically determine how much OT they were going to need for the next 12 months, which I'm sure many of you in the same position can identify with, that's actually quite a challenge. So once they come on site, we've already got identified, this is how much we will be able to work with them for the next 12 months, and we've kind of got to make that fit. So I start my assessments during a lot of naturalistic observation. I watch them in the classroom. If they live with us on site, I would go and watch them in the house that they're living in. I occasionally do home visits to the young people's own homes. However, one thing that I've learned a lot while I've been doing telepractice is that actually that's not very naturalistic, because just the fact that I am there in their home when they associate me with somebody that should be at college means that they do behave in a different way. And I will talk a little bit more about that later. As part of our assessment, we often use the MoHost. I think it's important to acknowledge that we use that as part of a baseline assessment. We don't find it sensitive enough to use as an outcome measure. And we also do assessments of functional ability and, where applicable, sensory processing difficulties. And it is the sensory processing difficulties part that I'm going to focus on today. So, as many of you are working in these colleges, I think you probably already know that our young people's ability to do standardised clinical observations is very minimal, if they're able to participate in that at all. And that for me is one of my biggest challenges, that the sensory integration practice test is put out there as gold standard, the best way to do assessment of sensory processing difficulties. But actually that requires someone to be able to follow verbal instructions. And if we need to sign to them because they're deaf, or we need to give them visual information to back it up, or gestures, then the test is no longer standardised. So for the people that I work with, it's just not an option. So instead I do unstructured clinical observations, and alongside them I also use some measures like maybe the sensory profile 2 or the sensory processing measure. But it is important to acknowledge that I'm using them outside of standardisation, because they are aimed at children with a parent reporting on their behalf. But unfortunately, the assessments that are designed for adults all require self-report, which again are not appropriate for my caseload. It was interesting to hear in Sally's poll that 48% of us, I think it was, would like to focus on how to demonstrate impact, outcomes and quality. And I think for us at Seashell, that is one of our biggest challenges. And what we've tried to do, because the standardised assessments for this client group are not there, we've tried to look at what other things are available. One example of this is that I sometimes use the Cohen-Mansfield agitation inventory. This was originally developed for use in dementia care. It's not standardised for this client group. I have tried to contact the authors to discuss whether additional testing around this is a possibility, but unfortunately they haven't got back to me, and I suspect they no longer work for that organisation. So I'm currently using it in its existing format, hoping that one day I will find a way to explore that further in terms of standardisation. Maybe that'll be my PhD one day, who knows. For those of you that have not heard of the Cohen-Mansfield agitation inventory, it's a scale used to score 29 behaviours, including things like screaming, hitting, scratching, stripping, and it scores them on a Likert scale ranging from a number 1, which means they never display that behaviour, right up to a number 7, which means they display that behaviour several times per hour. So the scores are done on an average of the last 2 weeks to try and negate the chance of them just having a particularly good or bad day when the assessment's filled in. But I found that for us, in a lot of cases, this is sensitive enough to show difference as an outcome measure. And I think it's about us being creative to look at other things that are available to allow us to record change following therapy, even if that's not in a fully standardized way. As I've said, when we're working with people with severe and complex needs, there is no go-to assessment. So it is really focusing on how we think outside the box and experimenting when we're trying to form our clinical hypothesis. And I think another thing that it's important to say working within education is that it's important not to feel pressured into making a rushed decision. I find that within the educational setting that I'm working in, the baseline time is the first 6 weeks in September. For me, the amount of new students I have on my caseload in September, there is no way I can do a proper assessment of all of their sensory processing difficulties, write that up, come up with a hypothesis, and then come up with goals within 6 weeks. And I do feel quite under pressure from the education team to, understandably, they've got targets to meet, but to fit in with writing the goals before I finished my assessment. And I think I'd be interested to hear from other people through the comments if they have similar challenges and if anybody's got any answers of how to overcome that, because I think it is important. It's always best practice to finish your assessment before you set your goals. Because I'm doing a number of different assessments, the main challenge for me then is how to pull it together to formulate that hypothesis. Sometimes I use a formal table with different headings for each sensory system or subsystems, and there are a lot of non-standardized formats out there that I think lots of people have tried using. And to be honest, the more experienced I've got, my preferred option now is to use a mind map. I will give you a case study later and I'll show you an example. But I think the advantage, of drawing in that way is that I've got complete flexibility to write down what's really important for that individual and make it really personal centred. I do have to admit though that they're much more difficult to add to clinical notes. I've got to admit that that's something that I do as I've become more experienced as a sensory integration practitioner. It's not something that I could have done at first. I really did need the structure of the analysis grid to prompt me and to make sure that I didn't forget anything. So just to touch briefly on the environment, in an ideal world, we'd always assess sensory processing difficulties in a specialist sensory integration clinic with the right equipment, the right suspended equipment, etc. However, we don't all have access to one. And for those of us that do have access to one, it's not always possible to encourage our client group to get to them. I'm fortunate that I do have access to some fantastic spaces to work in, but I do find that I often at first have to take the equipment to the person rather than expecting them to transition to me, because that can just be too much of a challenge before we've got a rapport. So this also comes back to that I mentioned earlier about assessment in a naturalistic environment. To give you an example of that, when watching someone climbing the stairs, I can learn about visual processing. Are they looking at the steps? Do they reach for the banister? Are there any signs of sensitivity from the light coming in through the window? I can learn about the praxis. Do they accurately form motor patterns to climb from step to step and negotiate any turns? Do they put one foot or both feet on each step? I can see the vestibular processing. Are there any signs of anxiety when they're going up and down the stairs, etc. And I think it's all these sensory processing issues that impact on function that really highlights to me why it's so important for OTs to have basic training in sensory processing difficulties, because they are absolutely key to optimising the function. So to get started with telepractice, I had a quick reflect back on what we've done at Seashell Trust during lockdown to enable us to work with telepractice. I think it's important to say there's still a lot of learning going on, but this is kind of up to the point that we've got to so far. So obviously, to start, we needed to identify a platform, and at Seashell, like I guess in most other work settings, that was done for us by the IT department. For us, they decided on Zoom, and once we'd had that decision, then as a therapy team, we wrote a procedure. It is important to protect both staff and participants. In that procedure, we referred to national guidelines. There are advice from the HCPC. We obviously needed to consider codes of practice. And we also needed to write some quite basic things about how to work from home to keep ourselves and our staff safe. Just things like thinking about, do you have pictures of your children in the background when you're on the webcam? Is it actually appropriate to think about moving that? The little things that we wouldn't usually have to think about when we're working on site, that it was just important to consider and record before we actually got to the point of working with the telepractice. And I think the next key thing for me was practice. For those of you that are in the COVID-19 OT WhatsApp group, I know there have been lots of comments about this at the weekend, and how to kind of get going with it and come across as professional to families when actually you're quivering inside, wondering if the IT is going to work and if you'll be able to do it properly, if there'll be a problem and what if it doesn't. And I think for me, I practiced with my team. That was my first step. And then as I felt a bit more comfortable with it, I practiced with people that hadn't been part of that practicing. So I practiced with my mum, my auntie, and I thought, if I can teach them to do it, not knowing anything about it, then I can also teach parents, carers, whoever it is that's working with the young people that I want to do the telepractice with. So once I'd got to the point of being ready to start the telepractice, I think my biggest tip here is start with a family you've got a good rapport with, a family that you will be comfortable with if it doesn't quite go right, a family that will give you honest feedback. And I think also it's important to have a plan in case it goes wrong. There are times when technology will let you down. Sometimes that's easily resolved, but sometimes, for example, during one of my telepractice sessions, I had a power cut. Obviously, that was the whole town had a power cut. There was nothing I could do about it. But fortunately, I'd written down beforehand the family's phone number. So I was able to ring the family and just explain, really sorry, I've got a power cut. I will ring you again as soon as the power comes back on and we'll be able to pick it up again. And I think if I hadn't had that, my confidence would have gone down and I would have probably had a bit of a panic. But because I knew that I'd got this backup plan, it felt a lot safer and easier to cope with. So to think now about how we can use telepractice, and I guess today is an example of, obviously this was originally planned face-to-face, but today here we are all learning to present online, which is a first for lots of us. And there are a number of different sessions that we've done at Seashell, ranging from face-to-face sessions with our children and young people. I've done some sessions where we've used some sensory strategies together via Zoom, which has been interesting to help family members see the types of things we're doing, but it's helped the young person themselves. I've been able to see whether they are over alert or under alert and model the right activities for them to copy. And then we've talked about how they can use those at other times when they're at home. And some of that has been direct talking with them on their terms, and some of it's also been involving the families. I've also done some assessment via telepractice. I have done more host assessment. And I think for me, this is one of the big things that I've learned that I will now continue to do differently once we are fully back on site. For me, when I do a more host assessment, I usually do them on site in different settings. And because of experiences I've had in the past where I've gone out to someone's home to try and do one at home, and they've responded to me and been more interested in me than the activity, I've stopped doing that because I felt that I'm not seeing the true picture of their ability. However, what I now have learned is me being there on a laptop at the side of the room. I've kind of handled it by discussing with families in advance and saying hello to them so that I'm honest that I'm there and I am watching, but then left my screen blank so that the young person almost forgets that I'm there. And that's given me some really fascinating insights into how they are doing activities at home with families that might be different to how they're doing them with us at college. And that's taught me a lot about how families support people differently to staff, and maybe sometimes how they might be over supporting or under supporting. And it's led me to get a real clear understanding of that, which has helped me to formulate my hypothesis and make my plan in a much more appropriate way to that young person and their home situation. We've also used telepractice for education sessions with parents. Either we've done some formal group training around sensory processing difficulties, for example, that we might previously have done on site. We've also done one-to-one sessions with families where we've talked about sensory processing difficulties but made it very personal to their child. And this has often led to identifying signs of over and understimulation for their child and thinking about practical strategies about what they can do in their home with the equipment that they've got, which is often very different to what we can do at college in a completely different setting. We've also done some e-learning, which has been a new thing for us. As a therapy team at Seashell, we all have lots of e-learning modules that we participate in about health and safety, safeguarding, all those kind of wider topics. But during lockdown, we've developed e-learning about meaningful activity that families have been able to take part in and other staff have been able to take part in. And we're also almost finished working on an e-learning session about sensory processing difficulties. I know that some NHS teams make it compulsory for parents to attend a workshop about this prior to doing assessment with their child. And I think possibly giving them access to e-learning might be a more accessible way of families working forward to allow them at whatever time of day is relevant to them to pick that up and be able to get some background information so that it helps them understand what the therapist is doing and why. So I'm going to move on now to my case example. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to call my young man Alan. He's 20 years old and he's got a non-specific learning disability. Prior to coming to Seashell Trust, he lived at home with his parents. He started Seashell Trust in September and moved onto site as a residential young man Monday to Friday, still going home to spend the weekend with his parents. The positives about him is that he's generally a very happy young man. He's got an infectious laugh and a lovely smile, and he's an absolute pleasure to work with. He struggles to follow instructions in any format. He's got no sense of danger, and he has one-to-one support throughout the day, every day, to enable him to participate in all activities of daily living. So this is an example of my mind map that I was talking about earlier. I highlighted, some of them do look a lot more complicated than this, and I have tried to share with you one that hopefully will be a little bit more understandable to you. I've highlighted the main difficulties that were having an impact on his function, and they're the things that I've highlighted in black. And then for me, because I'm quite a visual learner and colour helps me, I've used different colours to comment on the different sensory systems, which has helped me to pull it together and formulate my hypothesis for him. And so this led to my hypothesis that Alan's hypo-responsiveness to proprioceptive, visual, vestibular and auditory information results in difficulty formulating motor patterns, which results in difficulty with all activities of daily living. And for him, this is the point that I got to before lockdown. I think it is important to recognise that it would have been much more of a challenge for me to get to this without any face-to-face time with him. And I'm not in any way recommending that telepractice takes over face-to-face contact with somebody. I think it's important that we use it as an additional extra where we are able, although this has helped me to think about in situations like this where we're not able, it doesn't mean that we can't do any assessment at all. So I'd got to having a hypothesis before lockdown, and my plan had been to work with the staff, both in the care team and his education staff, as well as his parents, to identify what overstimulated and what understimulated looked like for him, and put a plan together of strategies for staff to support him working towards co-regulation. I think for this young man, self-regulation is never going to be achievable. He's never going to be able to recognise, I'm overstimulated now, I need to do a calming activity to help me bring me back to that just right level. He's always going to be dependent on other people recognising that for him and offering him the strategy for him to participate in. I'd also planned to do aside of that a block of one-to-one sensory integration therapy. Obviously, I haven't been able to do that, and that will need to wait until we get back on site and are in a position where we can work in that close range with people. So for this young man, with my telepractice, I set up 3 Zoom calls with his parents at fortnightly intervals. The first session, we did a bit of background information and general training about sensory processing difficulties. And then with his parents, I agreed the signs of overstimulation. We talked about the signs that they saw at home. And we clarified and talked a lot around, so what is overstimulation and what is understimulation? And for this young man, actually, sometimes that really wasn't obvious. So the advantage of this 2-weekly interval meant I'd done that session with his parents. I then wrote that up afterwards into a table of the signs of overstimulation, and I sent that out to the key people that worked with him on site. So his teacher, his key worker, key members of his care team, his speech and language therapist and his physiotherapist, and asked for their feedback around, did they think this was what overstimulation looked like for him? What other signs did they see that they felt were signs of overstimulation? And I was actually really quite pleased with the amount of feedback that I got from them. And also the fact that they'd seen and noticed different things. So I put all that information together and sent that back to the parents in advance of my next session, so they could also have a bit of time to consider that in advance. When we did the next session, we then agreed signs of understimulation, and I went through that same process. I did it with the parents first, then I typed that up and sent that out to the rest of the care team and got their feedback. So when we started the third session, we had a clear table of signs of overstimulation, signs of understimulation, and I followed that same process then, agreeing strategies. So I talked to his parents about what strategies would you use at home when he's overstimulated or understimulated, and then I sent that out again to the care teams to add in strategies that they'd learned, and then I finalised that again and sent that all out, and that now forms the basis of his occupational therapy programme. So I think for me, I built up much more of a rapport with the parents doing that than I usually would with parents that are not local. I feel like when parents are local, I quite often include them by meeting with them when they drop their child off or pick their child up from college. But for the parents that are only there perhaps on a Monday or a Friday morning, or maybe don't come onto site at all, I always do involve them with a phone call. But I felt the telepractice and them just being able to see what I looked like and me to kind of show them some of these things meant we had a much better rapport. And actually it was really lovely because the family then started to email me in between, giving either comments, feedback, or even in the case of this family, they sent me some little videos of, oh, this is him using the weighted backpack that we talked about. And actually, look, he's walking much more calmly than he did when you saw him walk in the room on the first session. And it just made it really practical and really purposeful for them. And something that I didn't mention is that when Alan first moved to Seashell Trust, he was placed in an upstairs bedroom in one of the residential houses, which was based on his parents telling me during his prospective student assessment that he could go up and downstairs at home with assistance from one person. Within a couple of days of him being in that upstairs room, the residential staff called for help because they couldn't find a way to support him safely. Coming downstairs was actually a real challenge and it was becoming unsafe. So I actually asked his parents to send a video of him at home. I'll just show this to you now. It's only a few seconds long. And I think most of you would agree that actually that was safe. And I learned so much from that tiny few second video clip. And what I learned is that actually I'd been quite judgmental, assuming that his family was supporting him in a way that wasn't safe. But actually it was purely environmental. His sensory processing difficulties meant that he needed that enclosed stairs to be able to lean on, and he didn't have that in the residential unit. The stairs were much wider, which are great for most people. They were much lighter, but actually for him, he needed it to be enclosed so that he knew where he was in relation to the environment. Oh, sorry. And just to whiz through very quickly, I recognise that this is really challenging, and I just wanted to think a little bit about sources of support. Clinical supervision obviously is one source of support, and I thought it'd be interesting here to try very quickly a poll. Ruth, could you launch the poll for me?
Yeah, Does that come up? If you could start voting, then this is you want people to vote. That's right, isn't it? If they
yes, if you are
carry out this
assessing
type of
people with sensory processing difficulties in any way, or if you're recommending sensory strategies, could you just say yes or no? Do you have clinical supervision with an advanced practitioner in air sensory integration? If you don't ever recommend sensory strategies, then please don't vote.
Okay, people are voting now. I'll give them just a moment or two more to get that vote in, and then I'll publish those and share them with you, Rachel.
Okay, because we are running short of time, Ruth, shall I keep talking through this and give people a little bit of chance to vote, and I'll just keep going through the slide? Is that okay?
I think people have voted, so I'm going to publish that now. Yeah. So you'll see there that of the people who carry out this sort of practice, we've got 21% of them have that regular clinical supervision and 71% do not. So
oh gosh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me just. Okay.
Okay, so I think, gosh, that is interesting, and that's, for me, I think I could not develop my hypotheses about the sensory processing difficulties in the way I do without that clinical supervision. So for those of you that don't get it, I think, you know, it might be something to reflect on and possibly ask for. There are also sensory integration network special interest groups that happen in most regions of the country that are another source of support for people. There are webinars that are free online. ASI Wise do some great webinars, and the classy webinars, which are international, so sometimes unfortunately they happen at ridiculous hours of the morning for us in the UK, but I think again they are great sources of support for people. I am aware of time, so I'm just going to whiz through this bit a bit more quickly. I think social media is also fantastic as a source of support. There's always been OT Facebook groups around there, general SI Facebook groups. Twitter is a great way of keeping up with people, as well as some of the WhatsApp groups that have developed. And I think therapists have really embraced that during lockdown, using other sources of support. And that's something that certainly I do a lot of learning from, listening to other therapists, posting their comments within those groups, and it helps me to reflect on what I'm doing, as well as me posting questions and getting almost free advice from lots of other therapists that might have different opinions. So I would recommend that people use the social media as much as possible.
Can I just ask, put a question to you there that's come from the audience? Somebody, Kate Boot, reflecting that there's a significant number of people who aren't getting supervision. Is there maybe a role for peer supervision amongst Natspec's own practitioners? Is that something you think might be worth following up on, Rachel?
Yeah, I think peer supervision is always useful, and I think it's identifying the difference between what people want out of peer supervision, which might be generalized ideas, and when people need direct clinical supervision from somebody with the extra ASI qualification to help them really clarify that they've got the hypothesis right before they start working on the treatment. I think for me, it's important to say that, and I was aware of time, so rushing a little bit when I got to my assessment point, but I do use things like the sensory profile as part of my assessment. A few years ago, I might have sent that information out to parents in a standalone report, whereas the more I learn about assessing sensory processing difficulties and the further I've gone with my SI journey, I realise that actually that is often incorrect for people with more challenging difficulties. These assessments were written for people, children usually, that are typically developing, and I often find that the information doesn't quite fit. So personally, I would never share that with a family unless I'd also done other clinical observations alongside of it and was confident that it was right. And I think that's where it's important sometimes to get the clinical supervision either on a one-to-one basis, or if you don't have the opportunity for that, then perhaps as part of a peer group, and maybe that's something that Natspec therapists could look at.
Okay, thank you. Has anybody else got any questions for Rachel? If you do, then do pop them into the questions pane, or if you want to make comments. There's a couple came through quite early comments reflecting on the fact that the very fact that we've been forced online has actually made it more accessible for some people who wouldn't have been able to physically attend. So there are silver linings to these clouds.
Absolutely.
Okay, we've not got any additional questions coming through now, but you've got Rachel's Twitter handle there, so you can always contact her directly through Twitter, but you can also come through Natspec if you wish to. We're always happy to act as sort of a go-between. Thank you very much, Rachel. That was very interesting. I'm sorry we had to cram it into such a short slot. We could have probably given you all an hour long. But some really interesting stuff there, and it's certainly giving people food for thought. Along with all the slides from the earlier sessions, these will be shared, so you'll have Rachel's references here that you can access after the event as well. So thank you very much, Rachel. Very interesting input. We will be taking a short break for lunch. I think a few people have indicated if we could just keep things running, that would be easier for them. So I will try to do that. We'll put a blank screen up and put all the sound off, and then we will regroup at 2 o'clock when Caroline Gosling will be joining us to talk about a whole college approach to total communication. Do keep going on Twitter over lunchtime, reflecting on what you've heard so far. And don't forget, if you've got any feedback or any comments on how you've used the Therapy for Learners at Home page, then do please send those to me. That's at ruth.perry@natspec.org.uk. So we'll take a lunch break and regroup at 2 o'clock. Thank you again, Rachel. Welcome back, everybody, to the afternoon session of our Natspec Therapy Conference. We had a great morning this morning with inputs from Kate Duggan, Sally Edwards and Rachel Johnson. This afternoon we'll be hearing from Caroline Gosling, who will be talking to us about a whole organisation approach to total communication. And then Kate Duggan and myself will be in conversation directly after that, talking about therapy during the time of a pandemic. And I will be sharing with you the therapy at home web pages that many of you were involved in creating. But I'm going to introduce Caroline now. Caroline and I are doing a bit of a double act here. Up in the Northwest, she will be talking to you and I will be moving the slides along. So just give me a nudge, Caroline, each time you want me to move the slides along. Welcome.
Thanks very much. I hope you can all hear me okay. I'm going to be talking to you about supporting a college-wide approach to total communication. I'll just be turning my camera off again and just so that everything runs as smoothly as possible. This is something that I was involved in my last post, actually. So yeah, if we nudge the slides on, we can get started. So I'm a speech and language therapist, and the college I was working in just wanted to describe a little bit about the background and the context we were working in. So a few years previous to to this new model that we were trying, we had a bit of a shift in the way our service was being delivered. There was an emphasis previously on sort of direct work and local authorities funding sort of, and being quite interested in the time we spent one-to-one with students or face-to-face with students. And that was changing to, it's hard to know from where I was at the time whether it was from the local authority or whether from the senior leadership team, but there was a bit of a shift in terms of looking a lot more around sort of supporting coaching and indirect sort of model of service delivery, which we welcomed in a lot of ways, because we know that adults with learning disabilities often don't generalise skills from one context to another. So as a speech and language therapy team, we felt there was a lot that we could do around supporting total communication, working alongside teachers and support staff. So we were shifting in this way. Our team structure at the time was made up of a lead, so someone quite sort of highly specialist, and then a couple of newly qualified hosts. We also had, as it's been picked up on before, quite a lot of changeover in staffing, including our teaching staff. So we had quite a lot of new tutors who hadn't worked in special education very long. Some of them hadn't been teaching very long. We were trying to think about how to work alongside them and coach them. And what we were finding was really is that sometimes the teaching team had quite specialist knowledge around very bespoke communication strategies, including sometimes skills around electronic AAC and different types of access. But we weren't always seeing the sort of more foundational, perhaps what we think of as more universal levels of input to ensure that the sort of communication environment and the classroom environment were accessible. So there was a bit of a mismatch really in some of the things we were seeing and how we wanted to support and help. And at the same time, there was a big review of people's contracts and working hours going on across the organisation, and the effect that had for us was that the working day became shorter for a big percentage of the staff team, which meant that the opportunities we previously had to deliver staff training were very much reduced, and there was only very small sections at the end of the day, and it was really only once a week that there was quite a small section for training, and obviously lots and lots of training to be delivered, not just from speech and language therapists. So we were trying to think, with all these things going on, how can we best work alongside the teachers and the support staff to sort of support total communication across the college day for the young people. And we tried a few different ways of looking at sort of giving advice and strategies, but we were struggling really to find something that was working and that was suitable. So if we move the slides on, thank you. So I'm hoping that this comes up as a poll on your screens. I wondered what your service delivery models look like, speech and language therapists. Oh, this is Rachel's poll.
Just hold on a second, I beg your pardon.
So yeah, speech and language therapist, oh fabulous, thank you. Speech and language therapist, I wondered in the college context you work in, what percentage of you mainly do direct work with students, or mainly indirect work, so coaching and training with staff, or kind of very much a combination of the two?
So we've just got people voting for a moment. We'll give them a little bit more time. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. Oh, just one or two more I can see coming in. And there we go.
Okay, so very much a combination is the predominant one. Thank you. So I hope this will be useful for you then, because we were still in our service continuing to do direct work, but we were very much shifting towards more of a coaching model. So hopefully the content of some of this will be helpful. Okay, thank you. So one of the team brought a communication checklist that she found on the Communication Trust website. I think it's called the Classroom Communication Checklist. You can find it on their website, and I've put a link on the PowerPoint at the end. And she really, although it was written for a mainstream school environment, so quite different from our setting, but we had a look at it and adapted it for the setting that we were in. And we found it really helpful because it described sort of 3 different areas of communication, and it made things really structured and clear. And another thing that I borrowed from somewhere else I'd seen was that we sort of tiered the approach for the teachers. But I'll explain a little bit more in a moment about that. Thanks. I've already said a lot of this really, but yes, we found it quite helpful that it divided up into environment, opportunities and interactions. And something I've seen from a service in Scotland around looking at accessible resources has tiered the sort of level of accessibility of what they were doing from bronze to silver to gold. And as there was quite a lot of advice and support on this checklist, I wondered if it would be helpful to tier that in the same way. So as we went through the checklist and adapted it for our setting and the needs of our young people and the tutors and support staff that were working with them, we then looked at what we considered as a speech and language therapy team was kind of minimal best practice, and we put that in the bronze category. And then we looked sort of up a level of what we would say was really a step beyond that, and put that down as a silver tier. And then finally the gold tier was at the very top. When we rewrote it in that way, it enabled us to sort of focus in on where each teacher was and work with them on the area that they were working in their session. So just to give an example, for instance, as part of the language learning environment, a bronze level area would be visuals used within the classroom, so students know what's happening next. We thought that was a minimum good practice. Silver was that the classroom would be organised in a way that's sympathetic to the students, considering different people's individual needs. And then the gold would be that learning resources and materials were labelled with pictures and words. And sometimes that wasn't always beneficial because we had some young people that couldn't see pictures and words, that maybe had a visual impairment. But we found quickly that once the tutors were supported from the bottom up, they were very able to make those links and think about what needed to be adapted for certain individual students. So in terms of the language learning opportunities, in the same way, this is just by way of an example really. So as the bronze standard, we have that session should have a clear beginning so that students are able to greet and interact with one another and know when something's starting. Silver, where students have an opportunity to engage in structured conversations or simple interactions with peers. That often has to be scaffolded by the staff and requires sort of more skill and sort of planning. And then the gold level, we have students having the opportunities to support and help one another. And then just an example of the language learning interactions. At bronze, we've got that staff use a slow pace in conversation, and that the student has plenty of time to take their turn. And then we've got staff interpreting and repeating back what a student says, more or less exactly, so showing them that they've heard, and showing them what they've understood. And then at gold, it was extending what the student might be saying by adding a small piece of extra information. So once we actually individually tiered the checklist into bronze, silver, and gold, and came together as a team to discuss what we thought. And those discussions were really useful because often we had different perceptions, and we had conversations around what would encourage teachers by being able to check things off in their toolbox, and should those things be earlier on in the checklist? Should they be lower down and rated as bronze, or should it reflect more what was a priority in terms of what students needed to make the environment accessible? Once we tweaked as a team, we shared it with the teaching team at college, for some feedback from them. And what was really useful for us was that the senior leadership team gave us a time slot to do this, and so very much supported it. So the teachers sat together in groups, and we joined them and talked through the tool and encouraged them to think about one of the sessions that they were teaching. That was really helpful because it enabled us to see things that we'd written that were perhaps unclear, and enabled us to kind of see the situation from their perspective a bit. So after we got some feedback from them, we refined the checklist a little bit, and we sort of gave them to take away with them as a kind of reflection tool before we started using it in the classroom. Okay, thank you. And what we found was that the tiering strategies really supported the teaching staff. What we found previously is perhaps that going into a classroom where with quite a new teacher, it would be difficult to know where to start in terms of just the amount of advice that you'd want to share. And given that that teacher might be teaching very different cohorts of learners across the week, they could potentially have an awful lot of advice just from speech and language therapy. And one of the things that the checklist helped us do was to sort of pick up on what we'd expect to see first and what we consider more foundational in terms of skills that we needed to see from them in the classroom to facilitate the communication of the young people. So it provided a really scaffolded approach, and it provided a lot of consistency for them in terms of the advice that was coming out from our team. So that was really helpful. It enabled us to share perhaps just the bronze checklist with some teachers, and others we would go through the bronze quickly in one session and move on to silver. But it gave really clear, sort of very specific targets for the teachers, and a lot of them said that it was really supportive. They didn't feel overwhelmed because we talked very specifically about what perhaps they could do next session to ensure that each criteria was present in their session to support communication. And we had some really positive feedback from them on it.
Can I put a question to you there, Caroline? This is from Darren Evans, and he's asking, how do you ensure direct support staff follow guidance when you're not present?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was going to come on to perhaps how this could be developed, because this approach, when I left Bridge, was very much working alongside the teaching team. But obviously, you've got a huge number of staff that are learning support staff as well, and we were starting to think about whether with their manager there, their support coordinator, how we could support them to develop skills in student interaction. I think yeah, looking at different ways of training and support is really important, isn't it? And Kate touched on earlier how part of the therapist's role, it seems, is around managing or leading a change process to support other people to see the value in therapy goals. And that's easier demonstrated in some situations than in others. Yeah, I'd be really interested in many people's sort of thoughts and feedback on that. There's a lot around individual relationships and trying to work out what barriers are for people in terms of following support and advice. Another thing that we've done, which wasn't really part of this project, but alongside really, was looking at our training and trying to make it very practical and less theoretical. I think we think as therapy staff, we often come to things in a theoretical way, and that's often how we're trained and taught. But sometimes slides with lots of text on and research backing up the points of what we're saying isn't always persuasive to the people we were working with. So we were trying to find, we developed some training using lots of videos with of the young people that the staff worked with, and we found that quite helpful. And sorry, that didn't really answer the question, Darren, but that's just some thoughts on it.
Just to add as well, Sally mentioned this morning in her audit of therapists, therapy therapists and the activities they're involved in colleges. One of the things that people were involved in was lesson observation or session observation. And I guess that's part of it as well, involving your experienced therapists in those observations to see whether the guidance from therapists is being put into practice then in the classroom. Just an extra thought. Shall I move on from there now for you, Caroline?
Yeah, thank you. So, as I said, we had quite positive feedback from the teaching team. I think the checklist helped a team of largely newly qualified therapists be clearer for tutors in what they were aiming towards. And it supported the speech and language therapists to give feedback because it somehow felt less personal when there was a checklist to jointly refer to, rather than verbal feedback or feedback in an email that was, perceived to be solely from them. Particularly when there were things around sort of someone's interaction style, which we can all take quite personally when we get feedback on the way we interact with other people. So it supported tutors to receive feedback as well because it was quite itemised and specific. Thank you. And I think some of the feedback we got was that as we discussed these very specific practices and behaviours that would shape and support the communication of young people, it was opened up conversations around good practice and sort of highlighted assumptions perhaps that we made, or assumptions that some of the teachers made that perhaps weren't always articulated. And I felt that in doing this process together, our goals and the teachers' goals became more aligned. So we then went on to draft a checklist for PMLD learners because the practice that we would want to see in that group was quite different from what we'd adapted from the tool for mainstream children.
Like just adding there, I'm looking at a comment coming through from Kate. Refers a little bit back to the question that was raised previously, but it's also talking about this goals aligning and staff working together. In terms of how do you make sure that the good practice that you share then does get implemented on a consistent basis by teaching or support staff. And Kate notes that it's very much about building sustainable skills through coaching and modelling, which then give staff the skills and the confidence that they need to continue to implement those strategies even when the therapist is not around.
Yeah, and often you can tell the direction it's going in. So yeah, sorry, that's not something I really clearly articulated, but what we tended to do, and it was different for each teacher really, is go in with the checklist on, say, week 1, and observe the session, and then give some feedback as to what we saw that was going really well and what we wanted them to continue doing, because it was really supportive of communication, and some things that they could just change to improve their practice. And we specifically referred to the points on the checklist, and we left that with them. Some people wanted a copy of the checklist, some people wanted an email, some people valued prefer a chat, and then we would sometimes, depending on the tutor, we might leave them for week 2 and then go back in week 3, or we might go back in week 2 to model some of the strategies that we talked about in week 1, and do something like that for perhaps 6 weeks. By the end of the 6 weeks, it was really good to note that some teachers were saying, oh well, I can try this out in the other group that I teach on a Tuesday morning as well, because they're working on this. So you get a sense really from their feedback whether they were receptive to some of the things that we were saying. And yeah, so that was one of the ways, and I think it did feel like it supported joint conversations generally a little bit more on goals and around communication. But we would record, obviously, in our case notes what we'd agreed, what we'd shared with the teacher, and what they said they were going to do, and then record the next time we had any input with them, record what had gone on there as well. So it was easy to track whether advice was being followed or not.
Thank you. I distracted you there for a moment. Shall I move you on?
Yeah, thanks. And something we were looking at going forward that the senior leadership team expressed interest in was using the tool as part of their, in fact, I think they started doing it while I was still there, as part of their observations of teaching and learning. So the tutors already had access to the tool and were being encouraged to use it as a reflective tool, and they were used to seeing it when we went in to work with them. And I think part of that was really positive for the teachers, because observations of teaching and learning were always quite a big event in the college, and people would get quite nervous about them. And sometimes they had a session observation for perhaps half an hour. But with the checklist tool being shared with SLT, we were able to sort of demonstrate a clearer picture of where the tutor had come from in terms of their practice around communication, and the plans they were making in terms of where they were going. So even if the session that was observed didn't go very well, the tool enabled the tutor to reflect on how they had changed some of what they were doing to facilitate communication with the young people, and the plan of where they were going next.
Okay.
Thanks. Next steps we were thinking of doing was to introduce it into sort of a regular part of supervision, so that goal setting could be incorporated with the teaching staff in terms of what they were going to work on next in their teaching sessions, and what they're going to focus on in terms of the communication output. And then, as we've mentioned with Darren's question, this really tackles training and coaching with the teachers rather than with the learning support staff. So probably looking separately at that, particularly the stuff around language learning interactions is particularly relevant to the support staff, because they're often involved a lot more in that than the teacher is, who's leading the whole group. So thinking about what that could look like as a separate and distinct piece of work, really. Another thing that happened is that the occupational therapy team started thinking about introducing something similar. So perhaps also tiered in the bronze, silver, gold approach, looking at different elements of good practice in independence. And I think it was strange, because in some ways it seems such a, once you've done it, it seems like such a clear thing that would have been a helpful thing to do. But the teaching staff some of them were really excited to be moving on to the next tier for their session, and were really motivated to sort of say, oh well, I'm going to work on my silver next, and I'm only 2 points off a gold and things like that. So the tier system really seemed to motivate some people as well, and maybe it made it much more quantifiable and clearer. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to acknowledge, although I'm at Seashell Trust now, this is something I did in my last post. And if there are any other questions or thoughts, it'd be great to hear from you.
If you'd like to drop any questions into the question panes for Caroline, please do. Would also be interesting to hear from anyone who's used or adapted the Communication Trust checklist for other uses. Sally Edwards from Portland College, who spoke this morning, she's noted that they use it in classroom observations when they're looking from a communication perspective. I wondered perhaps if anybody else was, and how they're using it, how effective they've found it, to what extent they've had to adapt it. As Caroline said at the beginning, it's a tool that was developed for mainstream settings, but with some adaptation, it certainly seems it can be very useful in our colleges too. Anne has asked where we can find the checklist. When you get the slides, you'll see we've included a link to the Communication Trust website so that you can download it directly from there. I think you'd say, Caroline, it'd be careful of using it exactly as it stands. What would you advise in terms of people coming to it for the first time?
I think probably best to judge on your setting and the cohort of learners that you have. Yes, I think, and the knowledge of your teachers as well, because some of the things are really quite basic, and for a very experienced teaching team, it might not be appropriate to put something like that on the checklist for their target for them. But as I say, at the time we had quite a new teaching team, and we had quite a new speech and language therapy team, so for us it was very useful as a starting point.
It's interesting to see how you've also used it really as a quality improvement tool. By putting those tiers in, you've encouraged people to keep thinking, well, what's the next bit of good practice we could do in this area? With a note from Sylvia Sokovska, who is commenting on the use of goal planning meetings, saying that's a good form of communication and a good way to ensure that we're all working towards agreed goals. We know, multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary working is such a key feature of effective practice in the specialist college settings, and finding the time to share ideas and to ensure that you're all putting practice together around the individual, working in that person-centred way, is absolutely vital to the success of our colleges. Are there any further questions for Caroline? No. Any final thoughts, Caroline, before we move on?
No, I was just going to say briefly then, Kate mentioned earlier about cohesion between different groups in terms of positive, working toward positive outcomes. And when she was saying that, I really thought, yeah, that's something that, on reflection, that this tool sort of supported us to do, really. Just encourage that more conversations and joint collaboration. So no, that's all really.
Thank you very much. In that case, I can see how it's being used for a catalyst for bringing people together, working towards shared goals. Lots of thank yous coming in on the questions pane. Caroline, Diana Mountain saying thanks very much, Caroline, really interesting. and lots of interest in looking at the tool and seeing whether it could work in other settings. So thank you very much for that. And to all the speakers we've had today, we are going to move in just a moment to a final sort of reflective session where Kate and I will be in conversation. That's Kate Duggan from Seashell Trust. We'll be thinking about therapy during the time of coronavirus. If you want to take a moment to email me or to put into the chat any particular uses you've made of the home learning webpage we've been referring to, or any other practices that have emerged during this time, then we'll pick up on those in a moment. But thank you very much, Caroline. We will move on to the next session. So I'm going to welcome back Kate Duggan, who's Head of Clinical Services at Seashell Trust, who is going to join me in a bit of a reflection on the day and also reflections on therapy in the time of coronavirus. So welcome back, Kate.
Hi, Ruth.
Okay, so what have you made of the conference so far? You've been busy on Twitter, I've seen.
It's been great. I think I'm just so delighted that despite COVID-19, we have been able to sort of connect together. I think so often, you know, we're working in such a specialist context. There is a risk that therapists can feel a little bit isolated. And having attended some of the previous conferences in person, you know, I've certainly got an awful lot out of learning from other people, you know, who are often facing some very similar challenges. So I think it's just been great that actually we have been able to, although it's not been in person, we've still been able to connect together to share ideas. And, you know, I think it would just be really good from today if we can use this to consider moving forward how we can do more collaborative working between therapists who are working with Natspec colleges.
Absolutely. I think you know, we'd already got a therapy forum, so we've got the contact details of a lot of people, bringing them together on a more regular basis and in different ways. It's certainly going to be a good way forward. We've had between 50 and 75 people tuned in during the course of the day, so lots of people here, and potentially more than would have been able to make it to a face-to-face meeting, and that is the advantage of doing things virtually. There are lots of disadvantages, of course, to not being able to see one another and to really have some of those you know, unplanned conversations that happen at these events, and some of the, you know, some of the networking that can go on. Obviously we miss out on that, but being able to bring a lot of people together, dipping in and out without having to leave their own college or their own home, it is a real advantage. What I wanted to do in the first part of this session is to share with you our Therapy for Learners at Home page. This is a resource created entirely by Natspec College therapists who came together in a real quick fire task and finish group in response to learners suddenly being sent home, to work out what effective practice looks like when you're trying to continue therapy for learners where you've built up the relationship face-to-face and on the college site, and to continue that once they're at home. So I'm hoping I'm going to be able to link us through to the Therapy for Learners at Home webpage. Bear with me. Here we go. Oh dear, you're seeing everything that I've got on my screen. That's terrible. So you'll see here, this is our home learning webpage, and this is the therapy webpage within that. On here, we've got a resource pack with various different elements. If you look at that list of 5 bullets there, so we've got a set of characteristics of what high quality therapy for learners at home looks like. That's regardless of the type of therapy and regardless of the way in which it's being delivered. We've got some advice from therapists for therapists on planning, delivering and then monitoring high quality therapy, coupled with some effective practice examples linking to that advice, And some of those also contain some resources produced by Natspec colleges during this period. And then at the end of the page, we've got some links to external sources you might find useful. You'll recognise some of the names there. They will be well known to you. Some of our speakers from today, you'll see Sally, Kate, but a whole range of individuals from different disciplines across the different colleges who came together to really reach some conclusions about what quality looks like. So we've got a checklist of what we think characterises any type of therapy delivered to students in their own home. That's downloadable here as a self-audit tool so that you can assess your own practice against that set of principles that our therapists came up with. We've then got, I won't go through them all, but we've got top tips really from therapists about planning, delivering and monitoring the quality of therapy. The little blue boxes give you some effective practice examples, and within some of them you'll see there are links to resources created. Some of them are web pages, some of them are documents, some of them are videos on colleges' YouTube sites, all freely available to you, all downloadable as well. So we hope that that's going to be of lasting use. One of the things people kept reflecting on was this is really important right now, but we actually think it's going to continue to be important in the future, that it's going to help learners keep going with therapists during holidays, if they're off sick. Obviously, if we've got a local lockdown situation, we don't actually have any colleges within Leicester City, some just outside of that, but it's quite possible, of course, we might find ourselves back in this situation again. But I would say if you haven't been there yet, do go and have a look at that site. It's really full of excellent information. See if I can navigate us back. So that's the web link, homelearning.natspec.org.uk. You can see across the top, please do recommend it to your colleagues, because there's also similar pages on each of those other headings: learning material, monitoring progress, working with families, maintaining physical and mental well-being, and how to handle transition into college and planning for transition out of college when you're working remotely. So I'm going to have a quick look now to see how many of you have already been on that site. Let me see if I can launch a poll better this time and get the right poll up. So first one, have you viewed that web page? Don't count the little look you've just had with us right now. But if you've looked at it before today, click yes. If not, you'll see I've phrased it as not no, but not yet. Okay, so you'll see there 40% have and 60% not yet. Please do go and have a look. As I say, I don't think it's going to be redundant as soon as lockdown is over. There's a lot on there that will remain very useful. I'm going to ask you a second question there, and this is really if you've already been on that page. It's a second question for you. If you've already been there yet, have you put it to any use? Has it inspired you to think about practice, ways that you might improve what you're doing or add to what you're doing? Let's give you a moment more. So we've got roughly a third of you saying that you've been inspired or taken something from it, and roughly 2/3 not yet. So as I say, please do go and have a look. I think you'll find something useful for all of you. And once again, I would like to thank everybody who was involved in creating that. I'm going to throw some questions out to you all now. I'm going to put them to Kate first, but while she's answering, do have a think about these questions yourselves. So the questions are, what's therapy for your students look like during the pandemic? Some of you have probably been operating entirely remotely. Some of you probably managing a caseload in college and with your students at home. From that experience, are there things that you've learned as a therapist? And if so, how will you take that forward and apply it to your practice more generally in the future? Kate has had the advantage of having these questions in advance, but while the rest of you are thinking, can I put that first question to you, Kate? Can you tell us what therapy for Seashell students has looked like during this pandemic?
Yeah, sure. So because we're a residential site, we've had to really divide our therapy team down into two core teams to promote sort of good infection control principles. So we've had a core team of staff who've been providing some support to our students who've remained on site throughout, because they're residential learners who live on site with us. So that's involved some of our therapy assistants and therapy staff have set up sessions and activities such as sensory motor sessions, which the students who are living on site can then access with their core teams of staff. And also some of the therapists in that core team have provided some fantastic resource packs to each of the houses on our residential site, which contain really bespoke and personalised specialist equipment, guidance, ideas for how the students can continue to access therapeutic support and meaningful activities in a wide-ranging programme, despite the fact that they are sort of having much less physical input, I guess, from therapy at this time. And then the other core team have been supporting the students that have remained at home and who are with their families. And a lot of work's gone on, particularly from SALT and OT via telepractice. And as Rachel alluded to, I think we've learned a huge amount about actually some of our services can be delivered really successfully using telepractice, and we've actually seen benefits around generalisation of skills into home environments that I don't think would have happened if it hadn't been for COVID-19. But there's also been challenges, and certainly for some therapists such as our physios, it simply hasn't been possible in some cases to deliver that support remotely. So some of our physios have actually gone out and done physical home visits that have been thoroughly risk assessed, and the appropriate PPE has obviously had to be used because they've not been able to remotely ascertain what that individual needs. And certainly I found that we've had to really rely on the guidance produced by bodies such as the CSP to make sure that you know, I'm supporting our physios, for example, to work within those professional bodies' guidance. The other thing that the team have done is we've launched a new YouTube channel. Because we found that for a lot of the families at home, they were really struggling, I guess, just to use the written guidance that we'd perhaps shared with staff historically to be able to implement therapy approaches within their home environment. So a lot of the therapists have recorded short video clips which are either information sharing on key topics that they might want to upskill parents around, or sort of live interactive sessions. So we've got a fantastic advanced physio assistant who's done some lovely videos using approaches such as Tai Chi, and we've got other sort of sensory stories or signed stories that have been shared through that YouTube channel. So I think, you know, the team have had to really diversify the way that they work, using new and different methods of service delivery, and just be really, really flexible in trying to continue to meet the therapy needs within the constraints placed on them due to COVID-19.
So what you've covered some of that in what you've just been saying, but what have you learned personally as a therapist during this period?
I've got to say, I mean, my role is sort of very leadership and management focused. So sort of speaking from that perspective, I think as a manager, I've just been overwhelmed by the flexibility, creativity and the responsiveness that therapists from all disciplines have sort of brought to this situation. And I think personally, I've really learned a lot about the importance of communicating information using the right tools. Certainly early days in the pandemic, I'm sure my team would probably tell you I was sending out very frequent, very long, detailed emails with lots of updates and new information. But I think I quite quickly realised that I needed to make sure I was sharing information in a way that people could process. And certainly we've been exploring the use of, Zoom meetings to get the whole team together, making sure everyone's receiving good quality one-to-one support via Zoom, and not just relying on lots of separate emails, but pulling together written guidance that people know that they can go to for the definitive correct information. And certainly some of that was actually shared as kind of embedded links within the Natspec information on the website.
And in terms of going forward, what as a team at Seashell will you take forward from all of this? Are there things that you weren't doing previously that you're going to hold on to? So the things that you've been sort of forced into, but actually have realised are a good practice.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think absolutely the telepractice is here to stay, and it will not replace the kind of direct support that the therapy staff provide. But I think there's a real place for it in terms of really trying to generalise skills into different environments within a student's life. I feel like we've probably all realised that we can work in a more flexible way and perhaps be more efficient. So I think moving forward, we will keep some of the flexibility in the working patterns, such as actually people still spending some time working from home, such as the meetings where everyone doesn't need to travel to a set location. And I think also in very recent weeks, some of our therapy staff have actually had to be redeployed to support colleagues within our care provisions and our day provision, which is still running for a small number of students. And I think what I've really taken from that is the huge benefits that we see from that really close collaborative joint working with colleagues in both education and care. So I think we'll try to really continue to, use that learning and make sure that therapy staff are working in a really integrated way with colleagues from other areas of the organisation.
That's a really interesting one, that one, the opportunity to see the same provision from a different perspective is it's quite scary being asked to do that, but having learnt from it, the things that you can take back to your own practice must be enormous.
Absolutely, yeah.
We've got one or two comments come in the questions pane, but do please add further ones. Sarah Gummit Hart has noted that there's been lots of remote Zoom sessions, but she says it's been insightful to be allowed into the family home and to witness the relationships between parents and their child, by which I mean our adult student. And she says, I intend to maintain these relationships through the student's time at college to continue to inform my work. Also, the opening up of options created via online working, both bespoke and pre-recorded or generic. That's an interesting distinction you make there, Sarah. It's something that came out when we were putting together the Therapy at Home webpage, that we talked about a sort of direct and indirect therapy. And actually, there's been a lot of take-up of those pre-recorded and generic videos, particularly, where young people have been able to access them at a time to suit them, with using them with perhaps a greater frequency because they're fitting them in when they feel like doing them, when they have the time to do them, when they've got the energy to do them, and that seems to have worked really well for young people. Now, a few people were saying that therapists were saying that they thought it was giving learners more autonomy to make decisions about what they did when, and that was also a real positive for the young people. Any more reflections from the group as a whole in that pane before Kate and I are going to move on to do a little bit of reflecting on the hoof about today's event itself? What we will do is I'll go back and have a look at the questions pane again before we wrap up. But I thought it might be useful to reflect a little bit on where we go next, Kate, because we've had lots of suggestions through the day of certain things that we could do. For those of you who haven't been with us all day, one of the things that we've been thinking about is, where does Natspec go next with its work to support therapists in our colleges? These are some of the suggestions that have come forward. If I read through a few now, Kate, then perhaps you can reflect on what you think's worth pursuing or how we might go about it. We've had a suggestion for a task and finish group looking specifically on measuring the impact of therapy. Some training or guidance on how to write up simple case studies as a powerful way of demonstrating impact. Something potentially about facilitating peer supervision between Natspec members. And then we've also had a suggestion, I think, about, let me just quote this accurately, setting up a clinical excellence network for AHPs using AIRS sensory integration in specialist colleges. So there's some of the suggestions we've had so far. Any reflections on those, Kate?
I think they're all really good suggestions. Because I've attended quite a lot of the sort of annual therapy conferences that have been run over the years, it strikes me that there's always a lot of real value to therapists having the opportunity to be able to connect and explore different issues and discuss those together. It also does strike me that there's then quite a long period before there's another event. And one thing I'm wondering is, given that it seems that today has been quite successful delivered remotely, I wonder what the appetite out there for perhaps having a slightly more frequent event, but keeping it as remote, even if we, or should I say when we get fully out of lockdown. So yeah, that would be one question, I think. Would people be interested to perhaps have a twice yearly or even once termly event of some kind? Perhaps wouldn't be something with such a formal agenda, but perhaps opportunity for people to get together and discuss some different issues. I think the other thing to consider is, certainly as a speech and language therapist, I'm aware that there's SENS clinical excellence networks that take place on a regular basis in lots of different specialist areas, and I'm aware that for occupational therapists and for physios there's similar types of forums. It's a good suggestion that I think has come from Kate Boot relating to perhaps a SEN around AIRS sensory integration, but I wonder whether there's scope for either some other SENs relating to specific therapeutic approaches, or whether people feel there might be benefit to having, for example, a SEN for speech and language therapists working in independent specialist colleges. I think we'd have to get some feedback from people on that, because I'm not fully aware of all the different SENs that already exist. And I know in the past at Seashell we certainly hosted a special schools clinical excellence network, but attendance to that sort of dropped, and that ended up sort of not continuing to run. So some of that I think is about what people feel like they need amongst the other clinical excellence networks or similar forums that they're part of. So Ruth, I don't know whether people are able to sort of make some comments to that, or whether it's something. Oh, lovely.
Lots of yes, I agree. So lots of interest in being connected more often, remotely being good. I think it would be great, wouldn't it, to keep an annual face-to-face, but to do more in between time remotely. The support for some discipline-specific groups, a chance to meet as department managers, perhaps, opportunity for lead therapists to meet to discuss good practice professional standards, an annual formal get-together, and then perhaps some discipline-specific meets through the year. A question, how do we find out about the clinical excellence networks that already exist? Do you know the answer to that one?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, if you're a speech and language therapist and you're a member of the RCSLT, you'll receive your monthly bulletin magazine, which does always have a page in it which has details of all the clinical excellence networks that share their information with the bulletin. From personal experience, I know there's also a number of slightly underground sends where you kind of have to sort of find out by word of mouth, really, the details of those. I'm not sure why that is. So what I'd encourage people to do is, Ruth, I don't know whether we're able to sort of make people aware of other colleagues that might be fairly local to them, because generally a lot of the sends operate across a specific geographical region, although I'm aware that if they're around a very specific topic they might be more national. But I think unfortunately some of it is by word of mouth, which isn't ideal, but if you can get in contact with therapists that are working in colleges that are either fairly close to yours, or if you know somebody else has got an interest in a certain specific intervention, then it would probably be good for you to make contact with them to see if they know about other sends that are happening that you might be find irrelevant to your practice.
Okay, I've got a couple of things coming in. Caroline notes she's the treasurer of the Northwest AAC SEN. Kate suggesting perhaps it would be interesting to set up, or she said, I've been involved in setting up a SEN for SLTs with an interest in positive behaviour support. It's been fairly easy to do. We could set up some, or some of you could take a lead on setting up your own SEN, and then we can share the information out across all of you. So that's certainly one to think about. But what we can do,
I think the other thing to do is to encourage people to contact their professional bodies. So generally, I think if you're establishing a formal SEN as a speech and language therapist, you would need to certainly notify the RCSLT of that. So I think that'd be another good source for people to go to their relevant professional body and ask them which SENs are operating, again, in their local area or in their specialist areas of interest.
Can I ask if you are, perhaps we could do a bit of an audit of the SENs that you are involved in, and then we could share that across the Natspec therapists. Is that an appropriate thing to do?
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea.
And then you can make contact with the people who are already part of that centre to get yourself an in. But perhaps sitting alongside that, we can do some, some groups of our own within the Natspec membership. Not necessarily, big meetings or anything, but even like little WhatsApp groups can be helpful, can't it? I know many of you, particularly in smaller colleges, feel quite isolated, and you're not sure whether not always entirely confident in the not saying you're not confident in your own practice, but it's so much harder when you haven't got somebody to chat to who's in a similar role, to check things out with, to compare notes. So perhaps we could look at providing some of that. I think as a good kickoff would be to put together this task and finish group on measuring impact starting next term. If you are interested in that, feel free to drop me an email now, today, where in the near future. I will put it into the Natspec briefing to say we're thinking of starting something like this up, and just lodge your interest with me for now. But I think we'll probably kick that off in September. But that seems to be one of the real burning issues, and something that we need to put our heads together in order to take forward. We have just bought Zoom at Natspec, and that does allow us to hold events like this and send people off into little side rooms to have their own conversations. So that's another format that we could explore at some point, so that we can hold an event with a full agenda for keynotes, but then for people to duck off into their own sessions, potentially less formal, just where you can chat to one another and agree your own agenda perhaps. So that's something else we could explore. But I think we're full of ideas today. We won't lose the momentum. That's so easily done after an event like this when we all get back to the day job. But we will take it forward. We'll have some discussions here at Natspec and with some of you about what you think the best ways forward would be. Any closing words from you, Kate?
I think it's just to say thank you so much. I'm so delighted that so many people have been able to join us amidst all the madness that is probably going on in everybody's personal and work lives at the moment. So thank you to everyone for your attendance and your participation in the discussions. And I think I'm just really looking forward to seeing what can happen next in terms of further collaboration between therapists working in specialist colleges.
Oh, thank you very much, Kate. Thank you for co-chairing with me and for your input this morning. Also to Sally Edwards, to Rachel Johnson and to Caroline Gosling, who all shared really interesting practice with us and gave us much food for thought. It has been a really interesting day for me. You probably can tell I'm not a therapist, I'm an educationalist, but increasingly over this term I've become more and more involved with the therapists at Natspec. And it's been great for me. It's been a real learning experience, and I've been hugely impressed by the professionalism, the commitment, the ability to spin on the head of a pin, and the speed at which you all work. So it's been a real benefit for me. This is one of my silver linings of the COVID-19 experience. Following today, I mustn't forget to say there will be an evaluation survey that will be on SurveyMonkey, so you'll receive a link from my colleague Beth. Please do complete that, particularly complete any open text fields to let us know, you know, what more we can do, what sort of topics you'd like to discuss in the future. We will get a video recording of all of this up onto our YouTube site. That's going to take a little bit of editing this time because we've got lots of long gaps in it. So I will leave that to much more capable colleagues to manage. But we will be sharing everything that was shared today, and also any of the references.
Say, on behalf of all the therapists that work in Natspec colleges, you know, thank you to you and to Natspec for supporting us to kind of come together, especially, you know, within the COVID-19 situation, and in pulling together that written information on the website. I'm sure people would agree that it's been so encouraging and heartening to know that, you know, we're not alone as individual therapy departments in Natspec colleges, but as an organisation, you know, I think that it's clear that there is that support there from you, and that you really do see the value of therapy and want to prioritise making sure that therapists are supported, you know, to be as effective as they can in their work in Natspec colleges. So thank you.
Oh, that's really kind of you to say, and it is that is very much the case. We are really keen to make sure that we support therapists, because we always talk about interdisciplinary working as one of the features of specialist colleges. What makes them special and specialist is bringing together these professionals, and of course the therapists are an absolutely key part of that. So on that mutual loving note, I'll bring today's conference to an end. Thank you very much for participating, and it's been a thoroughly enjoyable day for me. I hope it has for you as well. Goodbye everybody, and best of luck in for the rest of the term and in your preparations for the full return in September.